She had everything a billion-dollar empire, a room full of powerful men, and the kind of confidence that made ordinary people feel small. He had nothing a worn-out suit, a second-hand tie, and a daughter waiting at home. When Nolan Beckett stepped into that glass reception hall and told Sabrina Halstead her life was in danger, she laughed at him. 60 seconds later, bullets shattered the windows. The man she humiliated in front of everyone became the only reason she survived the night. If you're new here, subscribe, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The alarm went off at 6:15, same as every morning. Beckett reached over and silenced it before it woke Lily. He lay there for a moment, in the dark, staring at the water stain on the ceiling of their apartment, the one shaped vaguely like a dog that his daughter had named Biscuit 18 months ago, and still pointed at every time she walked past the bedroom door. He got up. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen where 2 of the 4 burners worked reliably. The rent was $1,200 a month, which was cheap by Chicago standards, and only manageable because Nolan had taken on a second gig 3 months ago doing overnight risk assessments for a logistics firm downtown. It wasn't glamorous work. Nothing he did anymore was. He started the coffee maker, pulled a carton of orange juice from the refrigerator, the store brand kind, not the one with the fancy kind, with the fancy label, and stood at the kitchen window watching the street below come to life. Chicago in November looked the way it always did. Gray sky, bare trees, and the kind of cold that didn't just chill you but settled into your joints and reminded you it was still there every time you moved. A delivery truck was already double parked on the block. A woman in a puffy coat walked a dog that did not want to be walked. Poured his coffee. He thought about the evening ahead. He'd been hired 3 weeks ago through a referral, Marcus Webb, an old colleague who now ran a private event staffing firm that handled security logistics for corporate gatherings. The assignment itself was straightforward on paper. Attend a formal reception at the Harrington Grand Hotel on Michigan Avenue. Observe the general security posture, identify any gaps, and submit a written assessment within 48 hours. $500 flat fee. No title, no badge, no authority. Just a set of trained eyes in a room full of people who didn't know they were being watched. Client was Halstead Industries. Nolan hadn't paid much attention to the name at first. He'd taken the job because the timing worked. The reception was a Friday evening, and Lily was spending the weekend with her grandmother, which meant no coverage issues, guilt about being gone. He needed the money, and the schedule cooperated. That was the whole calculation. It wasn't until Marcus forwarded the event brief that Nolan looked up the company. Halstead Industries, transportation infrastructure. $600 million federal contract pending. 30-year-old CEO named Sabrina Halstead, daughter of the company's founder, had taken over after her father's death 2 years ago. Forbes had done a piece on her. So had 3 other business publications. She was described variously as visionary, formidable, and, in one profile that seemed to have annoyed her, based on the response quoted later, unexpectedly young for the role. Had looked at the photos briefly, finished his coffee, and gone back to work. Dad. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:30, hair a mess, wearing the oversized t-shirt she slept in. She was 8 years old and had her mother's eyes dark brown, large, the kind that could make you feel immediately guilty for things you hadn't done yet. You're wearing the good pants. Good morning to you too. She climbed onto the kitchen stool and studied him with the focused suspicion of someone twice her age. Are you going somewhere fancy? A work thing. Tonight. Like a real work thing or a security guard thing? Set a bowl in front of her and poured the cereal. A risk assessment. Someone hired me to check over the security at an event. Lily considered this. You have to wear a suit? It's formal, so yes. Which one? He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. It was only one suit. Bought it 7 years ago for a colleague's wedding. Had it dry cleaned twice since then. And the jacket still fit well enough. The lining at the left cuff had started to fray. He'd looked at it that morning and thought about whether he had time to find a tailor before 6 p. He did not. The gray one, he said. Lily nodded seriously. You should get a new one, noted, Mom used to say. She stopped. Kitchen went quiet. Nolan kept his expression steady. After 2 years, he'd gotten better at this. The sudden appearances of Claire, in the middle of ordinary conversations, the unfinished sentences, his daughter would catch herself and pull back from whatever memory had surfaced, like it was something she didn't want to drop. She used to say that a suit is how you tell the world you take yourself seriously, Lily finished quietly. Looked at his daughter. She was right. She also said you took yourself too seriously sometimes. She was right about that too. Lily ate her cereal, drank his coffee. Outside, the delivery truck finally moved. He dropped Lily at his mother-in-law's apartment at 4 o'clock, came back, showered, and put on the gray suit. The fraying at the cuff was worse than he remembered. He folded the sleeve back slightly and hoped the jacket would cover it. Tie he chose was dark navy, slightly wrinkled, because he'd forgotten to hang it properly the last time he wore it. He pressed it between his hands for a moment, which helped marginally. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror. What looked back was a 32-year-old man who had not slept enough in at least 6 months, whose jaw was carrying 3 days of stubble because he'd run out of time to shave, and who was wearing a suit that was clean and pressed and entirely unremarkable in every way. Fine, it would do. He clipped his late wife's gift to his tie, a small silver tie clip she'd given him the first Christmas after they got married, engraved simply with the letter B on one side. He'd worn it to every formal occasion since. It was the only piece of jewelry he owned that meant anything. He picked up his bag, locked the apartment, and took the L train downtown. The Harrington Grand Hotel on Michigan Avenue was the kind of place that made you aware of your own footsteps. The lobby had 30-foot ceilings, marble floors, and flower arrangements that probably cost more than Nolan's monthly rent. String quartet was set up near the base of the sweeping staircase, playing something classical and European that Nolan couldn't name, but that communicated, very effectively, that this was not a place for people concerned about their rent. Uniformed staff moved through the space with the practiced invisibility of people trained to anticipate needs before they were expressed. Arrived at 6:20 and spent the first 10 minutes not going inside. He walked the perimeter. This was habit, something from his old life that had never fully left him. Before you enter a space, understand the space. Look at the exits, the approaches, the places where a problem could enter from and where it would try to leave. Most people never do this. Most people walk into a room thinking about the room. Walked in thinking about everything outside it. What he found, starting in the first 10 minutes, was not encouraging. Camera mounted above the northeast service entrance was angled 3 degrees too far left. Someone had adjusted it recently based on the marks in the mounting bracket so that it covered the decorative hedgerow instead of the entrance itself. Maybe a technician had bumped it and not noticed. Maybe not. The emergency exit on the east side of the building, the one that opened onto the side alley, had a door prop wedged under it. A small rubber wedge, the kind used by maintenance crews. Except there was no maintenance crew visible in the alley, and no equipment nearby that would explain why the door needed to stay open. He filed it. Inside, he took a complimentary glass of water from a passing server he didn't drink at work, hadn't for years, and began a slow circuit of the reception space. The main hall was on the 2nd floor, a glass and steel room that faced Michigan Avenue, capable of holding 300 people comfortably, currently holding around 250. The view was impressive. Floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittering below, Lake Michigan dark and wide in the distance. It was also a security nightmare. Glass on 3 sides meant visibility from multiple exterior angles. The layout funneled movement toward 3 primary choke points. The raised presentation platform near the north windows put whoever was standing at the podium in clear sightline from the building to directly across the avenue, which was, Nolan noted, a residential tower with balconies and rooftop access. He checked the fire alarm panel near the service corridor. The indicator light that should have been green was amber. Yes, see, amber meant the system was in test mode, which was standard for scheduled maintenance, but not standard for an occupied event space with 250 guests. Someone had switched it manually. That meant if something triggered smoke or heat in this room tonight, the alarm would not sound automatically. 3 things in 40 minutes. The camera, the exit, the alarm. 3 things that could each be explained individually. Together they were a pattern. He was still working through the implications of that when he noticed the waiter. The man was moving along the south wall, carrying a tray of champagne glasses with the practiced ease of someone who had done it many times. He was wearing the correct uniform white jacket, black trousers, the hotel's gold-embossed name badge. His posture was relaxed. His movements were fluid. His shoes were wrong. Not dramatically wrong. You'd have to know what to look for. Catering staff wore black dress shoes, soft-soled, quiet on marble floors. This man was wearing lace-up tactical footwear, matte black, thick-soled, the kind designed for stability and lateral movement under load. Kind you wore when you expected to need to move quickly in a confined space. Tracked him for 6 minutes without making it obvious. The man never delivered a drink. He moved through the room with purpose, but the purpose wasn't service. He was mapping the space, checking positions. At one point, he paused near the northeast corner and appeared to be studying his phone, but the angle of his wrist suggested he wasn't reading anything. He was checking the time, counting something. Nolan set down his water glass. He needed to speak with whoever was running security for this event, and he needed to do it now. He found the event coordinator near the entrance, a harried woman in her 40s with a headset around her neck, and asked who the head of security was. She pointed toward a heavy-set man in a dark suit near the bar, broad-shouldered, the 60s, the unhurried look of someone who'd done this long enough to believe nothing unexpected was going to happen. His name badge read Security Chief Halstead Industries. Introduced himself, explained what he'd observed. Security Chief listened politely. Then he explained that the camera had been repositioned to reduce glare. The exit was propped open because a floral delivery was still in progress around the corner. The alarm panel was in test mode because the hotel's maintenance team had done a routine check 2 hours ago and hadn't cleared it yet. He delivered all 3 explanations without hesitation, which was, Nolan thought, interesting, because hesitation is what you get when someone is genuinely searching for an answer. When the answers come that quickly, that smoothly, it usually means they were prepared in advance. The waiter in the south corridor, Nolan said. White jacket, north side of the room. He's wearing tactical boots. The security chief looked across the room. He looked for approximately 2 seconds. Then he said, catering staff, bring their own footwear. Hotel doesn't regulate it. Nolan said nothing. Is there anything else? There wasn't not that this man was going to act on. Thanked him and moved away. He needed to talk to Sabrina Halstead directly. This turned out to be more difficult than it should have been. She was at the center of a cluster of executives near the presentation platform, the kind of loose social formation that was simultaneously casual and impenetrable, the sort that told you exactly who held the power in the room by who was angling their body toward whom. Sabrina Halstead was the point everyone was angling toward. It was not what he'd expected, which he acknowledged was a thought that said more about his assumptions than about her. She was younger looking than the photographs, not in an uncertain way, but in the way of someone who moved through a room like the room had been arranged around her, rather than the other way around. She wore a dark blue dress, minimal jewelry, and the kind of confidence that didn't perform itself. She was speaking with 3 men who all had the polished look of people who attended a lot of events exactly like this one. Waited. Then he stepped forward, Miss Halstead. My name is Nolan Beckett. I was hired to assess security for this event, and I need to speak with you privately. She turned. She looked at him, a quick, practiced assessment, the kind of look that takes in a person the way you take in a room, cataloging details in order of significance. He watched her eyes travel from his face to his jacket to the fraying cuff that he'd failed to hide entirely. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted behind it. Mr. Beckett, Mr. Beckett. Her voice was precise, unhurried. I appreciate your diligence, but I have a security team that I'm confident in. If you have concerns, I'd encourage you to direct them to. I did, Nolan said. He explained everything away very smoothly. Too smoothly, and one of the men working this room as a server is wearing tactical boots. The fire alarm system has been manually switched to test mode, and an emergency exit has been deliberately propped open. One of the executives, a man in his 50s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades expecting to be deferred, made a sound that was almost a laugh. Tactical boots? Thomas, Sabrina said, not looking at him. Still watching Nolan. Miss Halstead, Nolan continued, keeping his voice even. I'm asking you to consider leaving the reception hall. Just temporarily. There's a private lounge on the east side of the May. What you're describing, she said. Her tone had shifted into something carefully professional, the tone of someone who has handled uninvited opinions before and does so with practiced efficiency. Are routine logistical details that my team has already accounted for. I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Beckett. Her eyes went briefly again to the suit, to the cuff. I'm not certain that someone at your level of engagement with this event is in a position to be telling me what I should and shouldn't do. The words landed in the space between them like something placed deliberately on a table. Thomas, the silver-haired executive, did laugh now. One or two others in the orbit shifted their weight with the barely suppressed amusement of people who've watched someone be reduced and find it quietly satisfying. Did not respond to any of it. He looked at Sabrina Halstead and said simply, I've identified what I believe is an active threat in this room. I'm asking you to take it seriously. She held his gaze for a moment. Thank you for your concern. Enjoy your evening. She turned back to her group. Nolan stepped back, stood at the edge of the reception floor for about 45 seconds, weighing his options, running through what he knew and what he didn't, deciding whether there was something he'd missed that changed the picture. He didn't think so. He turned toward the presentation platform, toward the north windows with the city spread out below them, toward the building across Michigan Avenue with its balconies and rooftop access and its clean sightline, to the spot where Sabrina Halstead would be standing in approximately 20 minutes to receive the ceremonial signing of a $600 million transportation contract. And then he saw it, a point of red light, moving, not moving the way a laser pointer moves when someone is being careless with it. Moving with intention, crawling slowly across the white tablecloth near the edge of the platform, finding its way, searching. Was already moving. He crossed 12 feet of polished floor in the time it took the room to register that someone was running. He hit Sabrina Halstead from the side, arm around her waist, driving both of them behind the massive ice sculpture that anchored the corner of the presentation area, a 4-foot-tall rendering of the Halstead Industries logo, dense enough to stop light rounds and buy seconds. Window behind the podium exploded inward. Not one shot. 4, in rapid succession, the sound enormous in the enclosed glass space, the difference between a gunshot outside and a gunshot in a room of glass and marble being approximately the difference between normal and catastrophic. The podium disintegrated. A section of the north railing buckled. The champagne display table near the platform went sideways, sending glass and liquid across 15 feet of floor. The screaming started. 250 people discovering simultaneously that the elegant room they were standing in had become something entirely different. Nolan held Sabrina down behind the ice sculpture. His hand was on the back of her head without thinking about it, not a gesture. Just a reflex. Years of old training surfacing, without his permission. She was not screaming. He'd registered that. She was breathing hard, pressed flat against the marble, but she wasn't panicking. Stay down, he said. I am down, she said. Her voice was tight but controlled. Move from this position until I tell you. Don't raise your head. Look toward the windows. What? There's at least one shooter across the avenue. Possibly more inside the building. I need 30 seconds. She said nothing. He took his 30 seconds. The ice sculpture was positioned at an angle that put it between them and the north windows, which covered the primary external threat. What he needed to know was what was happening inside. He had two options directly, which meant exposing himself or find a reflection. The shattered champagne table had left a broad spray of broken glass across the floor. 3 large serving platters had fallen and come to rest at angles. Used them. In the distorted silver reflection of the nearest platter, he could see the south wall. One of the men he'd observed earlier, not the waiter in tactical boots, a different one had stopped pretending. Produced a weapon from somewhere and was moving through the panicking crowd, using the chaos as cover, working toward the presentation area. Looked at Sabrina. She was watching him. Her dress was wet from spilled champagne. There was a small cut on her forearm from shattered glass. He'd intervened. She was lying on the floor of her own reception in front of people who'd come here to celebrate her. And she was looking at Nolan Beckett with an expression that was trying very hard not to be afraid. He thought about Lily. Briefly, he always thought about Lily before he decided to do something dangerous. Then he thought about the thing he'd said to himself 3 years ago, after Claire died. Yes, he'd intervened when he was trying to figure out who he still was, without the career that had defined him, and without the person who had anchored him. What you know, use it. Here's what's going to happen, he said quietly, close to her ear. There's a man coming from the south wall. I'm going to intercept him. When I move, you move to the service corridor. It's behind you. 10 feet with the red stripe along the bottom. You push through it and you stay there. You don't open it until I come for you, or until you hear police. Understood? She stared at him. Miss Halstead. Sabrina, she said. And yes, stood. He nodded. Nolan Beckett, 32 years old, father of one, owner of one gray suit with a fraying left cuff, federal protection specialist who had spent the last 3 years convincing himself he was done with all of this, got up off the marble floor and went back to work. The man from the south wall was 12 feet away when Nolan moved into his path. The attacker had the bulk and posture of someone with training, probably military background, private contractor type, used to operating in controlled chaos. He'd been counting on Nolan being a scared civilian, getting out of the way. He adjusted that assumption too slowly. Nolan came in low, under the weapons line, driving his shoulder into the man's solar plexus with the full weight of his forward momentum. The gun discharged into the ceiling, harmlessly, plaster raining down, and then Nolan had the wrist, controlling the weapon hand, and what followed was not elegant or cinematic. It was fast and ugly and hurt both of them. The attacker was strong, and he knew how to fight, and Nolan took an elbow to the side of the face that split the skin above his cheekbone and made his vision white for half a second. Nolan was angrier. That's the part nobody talks about when they discuss trained professionals. The training matters, the reflexes matter, but so does the thing underneath, the reason you're willing to absorb an elbow to the face and keep moving instead of recoiling. Beckett was angry in the way a quiet man gets angry. Felt theater is noise, yet just a cold and steady forward motion that didn't stop. He stripped the weapon, put the man down, and secured him with his own belt in a way that would hold long enough. He was on his feet and moving again in under 90 seconds. The screaming in the hall had shifted character, no longer the sharp, shocked screaming of initial impact, but the sustained, terrified sound of people trying to find exits that had been sealed. Guests were piling against the main entrance doors. Staff were frozen. The string quartet had abandoned their instruments. He got to the service corridor door with the red stripe along the bottom. He knocked twice, then once. The code he'd told her, without calling it a code, just a knock pattern, she'd remember because it was specific. The door opened. Sabrina Halstead was inside, standing, and with her were 2 other people, her assistant, a young woman of maybe 25, who was shaking badly. and an older gentleman in a tuxedo who'd had the presence of mind to follow Sabrina into the corridor rather than join the main crowd. She looked at Nolan's face. The cut above his cheekbone was bleeding in the way face cuts do efficiently, dramatically, more than it needed to. "You're hurt," she said. "It's surface. We need to move." He looked at the assistant. "Can you walk?" The young woman nodded, not fully convincingly. "Everyone stays close. Everyone stays quiet, no phones. We're going deeper into the building." "My phone has no signal anyway," Sabrina said. Looked at her. "Say that again." "I've had no cell signal for at least 20 minutes. I assumed it was the building. It's not the building." Signal jamming. Deliberate, targeted, expensive equipment, the kind not available to amateurs or opportunists. Kind used by people who plan carefully, who have resources, who have had time to prepare. This was not a robbery. It wasn't a random attack. Someone had spent weeks, maybe months, engineering tonight specifically. Guided them down the service corridor, deeper into the hotel's mechanical interior past laundry carts and equipment, cages, and the low hum of ventilation systems, his mind already working through what he knew and what it meant. 3 compromised security features, a mole in the catering staff, signal jamming, an attack time precisely to coincide with the moment Sabrina would be most visible, most exposed, most predictable. Whoever wanted her dead had known exactly where she'd be standing and exactly when. That meant someone on the inside, someone who knew her schedule, someone she trusted. He said none of this to Sabrina yet. She was holding herself together with visible effort, and he needed her functional, not unraveling. Behind them, through the thick walls of the service corridor, they could still hear glass breaking and people shouting. The city lights of Chicago filtered dimly through a small utility window at the end of the hall. Chet checked his watch. 6:47 p.m., 27 minutes since he'd walked in and started noticing things that didn't fit. 27 minutes since a woman in an expensive dress had looked at his worn suit and decided he couldn't possibly know what he was talking about. He wasn't thinking about that now. He'd think about it later, or not at all. Right now, there were people behind him who needed to get out of this building alive, and there was someone still in this building who was making sure that didn't happen easily. Stopped at a junction in the corridor and listened. Footsteps, 2 sets, coming from the East Branch, moving with purpose, not panic. He held up a hand still, and the small group behind him went silent. Footsteps slowed, then stopped. Then, from the East Branch, a voice that Sabrina clearly recognized, because he heard her breath change, heard the small, involuntary sound she made before she caught it. The voice was calm, familiar, friendly in the particular way of someone who had been friendly for years. "Sabrina, are you there? It's Victor. Sabrina, I'm here. I'm going to get you out." She moved forward instinctively. Nolan's hand came up and stopped her. Roughly, just firmly. She looked at him. He looked back at her and he shook his head. Yet, not until he understood why Victor Langley, her most trusted executive, the man who had worked beside her father for 2 decades, the man who was supposed to be in a board meeting in New York, was here, in this service corridor. Yes, he'd intervened in the middle of an attack that had been planned by someone who Sabrina Halstead would be standing tonight. Yet, Sabrina stared at Nolan in the dim light of the service corridor. The sounds of the attack still echoed above them, and for the first time, she did not argue with him. Victor Langley's voice came from the East Branch of the corridor. This time it carried a slightly different quality, a shade more urgent, distinct, the way a voice changes when it isn't getting the response it expected. "Sabrina, I can hear people. I know you're nearby. Come toward my voice. I have a safe route to the parking level." Watched Sabrina's face in the dim light. He could see the conflict working through her years of trust, pulling against a stranger's hand on her arm, against the instinct this particular stranger had earned in the last 30 minutes. Victor Langley had been part of her father's company before she was old enough to attend board meetings. He'd sat at her father's bedside in the last weeks. He'd given the eulogy. He was the person Sabrina called when something at the company went wrong, and she wasn't certain how to handle it. Watched all of that on her face. He kept his hand where it was. "Why is he here?" he said, barely above a whisper. "He was supposed to be in New York," she said, just as quietly. "Board subcommittee meeting. It was on the calendar for 2 weeks. Did you tell him your exact location in the build for tonight? Your position on the platform, your timing?" She stared at him. The event brief went to senior leadership. "Who prepared it?" A pause. Small but significant. "Victor's office manages executive scheduling." Nolan said nothing. He didn't need to. He watched her work through it the same way he had not wanting to arrive at the conclusion, arriving at it anyway, because the logic didn't leave room for anything else. Victor's footsteps started again, moving closer but slowly. Testing. Nolan made a decision. He leaned back and spoke quietly to the assistant, whose name, he'd learned in the corridor, was Priya, and to the older gentleman in the tuxedo, who had introduced himself simply as Bernard, and who had the careful stillness of someone accustomed to staying calm in difficult situations. "There's a maintenance stairwell, 40 feet ahead on the left. Takes you down to the parking sub-level. At the bottom, there's a fire door that exits onto Huron Street. Now, don't stop. Don't use your phones until you're outside and away from the building. The signal jam has a radius. You'll know when it clears, because your phone will reconnect." Bernard nodded once, put his hand briefly on Priya's arm, and moved. Priya followed, clutching her small bag against her chest, not looking back. Turned to Sabrina. "You go with them." "No." Halstead Sabrina. She said it with an edge that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. "And if Victor is what you think he is, then he knows my face, my team. He will find me faster than you can protect me if I'm separated from you and running through a parking structure with a woman who can barely walk straight. I stay with you." He looked at her. She looked back. He was not going to win this argument, and they didn't have time for it anyway. "Then stay behind me," he said. 3 feet. Match my pace. If I stop, you stop. If I go down, you run toward the stairwell Bernard just took. Hesitate. Don't come back. Understood. I mean it. Come back. I heard you the first time. Victor's footsteps were close now, maybe 20 feet from the junction. Calculated quickly. The east branch joined the main corridor at an angle that gave him a blind spot to work with. If Victor came around the corner expecting to find a frightened executive and a security consultant, he'd be wrong on both counts, and the 1 or 2 seconds of recalibration would be enough. Victor didn't come around the corner. He stopped. Silence stretched out in the corridor, broken only by the distant sound of shouting and the low mechanical breath of the ventilation system. A different sound. Victor's phone. A message alert. Quiet double chime of a notification, and then his footsteps again, but moving away now. Back the way he'd come. Faster. Nolan waited 10 seconds. He moved to the junction and looked down the east branch. Empty. He crossed to the spot where Victor had stood. On the floor, probably dropped when Victor checked his phone and pocketed it quickly, was a small folded card. Cream-colored, embossed with the Harrington Grand's logo. Picked it up and turned it over. On the blank inside face, someone had written in pen, 42. Confirm position. He read it twice. Pocketed it. "What does that mean?" Sabrina asked. She was 3 feet behind him, exactly where he'd told her to be. He hadn't heard her move, which told him something about her that the Forbes profiles hadn't. "It means he's not acting alone," Nolan said. 42 is a floor number. Someone is coordinating his movements from up there. They just sent him somewhere. He turned. "Does the 42nd floor of this building mean anything to you?" "A client suite, a private event space. Halstead Industries has a long-term executive suite on the 42nd floor," she said. The words came out evenly, but her jaw was tight. "Victor arranged the lease 3 years ago. It's used for private client meetings. I've been there maybe a dozen times." There it was. Nolan didn't say anything dramatic about it. He just turned and started moving again, back the way they'd come, toward the stairwell, Bernard and Priya had used but not down. "We're going to 42?" Sabrina said, keeping pace. "We're going somewhere we can see the building's security feeds. There's a secondary control room on 38 Hotel. Security uses it as an overflow station. The main security panel has been compromised. 38 might still have an independent feed." "How do you know about a secondary control room?" "I read the building layout before the event. It's in the fire code filing with the city. Public record." He pushed through the stairwell door. "I do that with every assignment." She was quiet for a moment as they began climbing. The stairwell was utilitarian bare concrete, metal railings, fluorescent lights that buzzed slightly and made everything the color of old paper. Their footsteps were loud, no matter how carefully they moved. "You do thorough work," Sabrina said, "for someone I was told was a mid-tier independent contractor." "I was told the same about myself," Nolan said. "I've started to agree with some of it." She almost said something in response to that. He heard the breath that precedes a sentence, then the decision not to use it. Smart. They were in a stairwell with concrete walls that carried sound in ways open spaces didn't. They climbed in silence. 7 flights. By the third, Nolan's ribs were informing him that absorbing an elbow to the facades and driving close his shoulder into a trained attacker's midsection in close succession had done things to his upper body that he'd be feeling for days. Cut above his cheekbone had slowed, but not stopped. He could feel it tightening as the blood dried. At the 35th floor landing, he held up his stopped. Footsteps above them. Single set, descending, moving at the pace of someone who wasn't fleeing, wasn't patrolling, someone walking with purpose and a destination. Opened the door to the 35th floor, moved Sabrina through it, and pulled it mostly closed behind them. Through the gap, he watched the stairwell. A man descended past their level without slowing. Large, dark jacket, the kind of deliberate non-presence that security-trained people learn. He was carrying something under his arm, a black case, flat, roughly the size of a laptop bag but thicker. His eyes were forward, not checking corners, which meant he was either very confident in the space or very certain no one who mattered was in it. The footsteps faded downward. "One of Victor's people?" Sabrina asked. "One of someone's people," Nolan said. "That case electronic equipment, based on the way he was carrying it. Could be the jamming hardware. If they're moving it, that means either they're repositioning or they're preparing to clear out." "Which means what?" "It means the timeline is moving faster than they planned. Something didn't go right." He paused. "You didn't die when you were supposed to." "That's what didn't go right." She absorbed that without visible reaction. He was starting to understand that about her. She processed difficult information internally, completely, before she showed anything. It made her appear cold to people who didn't know what they were looking at. He was beginning to think it was something else entirely. They reached the 38th floor. The secondary security station was a room the size of a large walk-in closet, tucked behind the hotel's administrative offices. Got through the lock with a method he didn't explain and didn't particularly want to, and inside they found exactly what he'd hoped for: an older monitoring system, separate from the main building network, with its own hardwired feeds from cameras throughout the hotel. Wireless connection, no way to manipulate it remotely. The screens were small, and the resolution was not impressive, but the feeds were live. Pulled up the second floor reception hall first. What he saw was controlled chaos working its way toward order. Police had arrived. The camera angle showed uniformed officers at the main entrance. Guests being caught and guided toward the street in groups. Paramedics. Someone had found a way to force the jammed exits open. The main reception space was shattered and empty. The podium, a pile of splintered wood. The north windows gone entirely. Vember air pushing the curtains inward. Active shooters visible on the second floor. They'd moved. He switched feeds. 3rd floor. 5th lobby. Sabrina stood beside him watching the screens. She was close enough that he was aware of her, the tension in her posture, the controlled evenness of her breathing, the way her hands rested at her sides, with a deliberate stillness that was not calm, but was doing a very good impression of it. She said. On the lobby feed, moving through the service entrance on the east side, Victor Langley. He was walking fast, head down, one hand pressed to his ear, receiving instruction through an earpiece. Behind him, two men, not hotel staff, not guests. The way they moved said everything. He's heading for the elevator bank, Nolan said. East side. That's the private elevator that goes directly to the executive suites. Including 42. He watched Victor disappear from the lobby camera's range. Switched feeds, found the private elevator corridor. Victor pressed the button, waited, stepped inside when the doors opened. Two men went with him. The doors closed. He's not running, Sabrina said. There was something careful, in her voice, not disbelief exactly, more like the specific texture of a person processing betrayal in real time, finding the shape of it, understanding that it is larger than they thought. He's not clearing out, he's going up. Because whatever the original plan was, whatever he needed you dead, for it isn't finished yet, Nolan said. Your death was the first step, not the whole thing. She turned from the screens. Then what's the second step? He looked at her. He had a theory. He'd been building it since he'd found the 3 compromised security features. Since the fire alarm in test mode, and the camera angled wrong, and the exit propped open, since all of it had started arranging itself into the outline of something much larger than one woman's assassination. The transportation contract, he said. The $600 million deal. What happens to your company if you die tonight? Sabrina didn't hesitate. She'd clearly already thought about this. The board goes into emergency session. There's a succession clause. Interim leadership defaults to the senior executive officer until a new CEO is confirmed. That's Victor. And once he's running the company, he controls the contract negotiation. He controls whether it gets signed. Her voice had gone flat in the way voices go flat when a person is keeping emotion out, because if they let any in, the rest of it comes with it. Contract grants access to city infrastructure. Bridges, tunnels, emergency communications networks. It's not just a transportation deal, it's a systems access agreement. Someone wants that access, Nolan said. Someone who isn't the city. Victor's been your most trusted executive for how long? 14 years, a pause. He hired me my first summer internship. He was my father's. She stopped. Started again. He was there when my father died. I called him before I called anyone else. Said nothing. Nolan said nothing. There was nothing useful he could say to that, and he'd learned a long time ago that the impulse to fill silence with comfort was usually more about the person doing the filling than the person who needed the space. She stood there for a moment with that. She straightened, and something settled back into her expression, not coldness, hardness. Something more like the particular resolution of a person who has decided that grief is a thing they will deal with completely and correctly later, and that right now there is work to do. What do we do? She asked. He was already thinking through it. Options, risks, what they had available versus what they needed. Police were in the building. That was something. The main security system had been compromised from the inside. He'd already established that the security chief was, minimum, complicit in the evening's arrangements. Calling the police directly from a hardwired hotel line was possible. It would take time, require explanation, and Victor's people would have the 42nd floor secured long before any response reached them. He needed to understand what was on 42 before he could do anything useful about it. I need to go up, he said. I need to see what Victor is doing on that floor, and whether there are hostages. The event had staff members who would have been routed to upper floors during the attack to keep the building's other guests contained. If Victor has people up there managing that, there may be civilians involved. You're going to the 42nd floor. I'm going through the building's maintenance system. There's a mechanical access shaft that runs parallel to the main elevator bank hotel-scale HVAC system. Comfortable, but it gets me to the 42nd floor without using any route Victor controls. She looked at him with an expression that was partly disbelief and partly something that had no clean name, the look of someone revising an assessment in real time, brick by brick. And me, she said, you stay here. Lock the door from the inside. Open it for anyone. The hardwired phone on the desk, pick it up. Wait for a hotel operator. Tell them that you need police to the 38th floor administrative office. Keep saying it until someone acknowledges. And if they don't come, come. It might take longer than you want. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Turned back. There was something he needed to say, and it wasn't a professional briefing item. It was just a thing that was true, and that she deserved to hear before he went through a ventilation shaft on her behalf. You asked earlier when we were in the main corridor whether I was actually qualified for this. I didn't ask, she said, I stated. Publicly. In front of people. He held her gaze. I know what I'm doing. I want you to know that. Because I need you to think well of me. Yes, he'd intervened, because you're about to be alone in a locked room while I go deal with the man who tried to have you killed tonight. And you should know whether the person you're trusting with that has any idea what he's doing. She was quiet for a moment. Who are you? She said. Before the second-hand suit and the independent contracts. It wasn't the right time for the full story. They both knew that. But she'd asked it directly, without artifice, the way she seemed to do most things, and he found he didn't want to deflect it. Federal Witness Protection Operations, he said. 8 years. I ran protection details for high-value government witnesses during active prosecutions. Complex situations, organized crime, political corruption, cases where the threat environment was ongoing, and the subjects couldn't be moved to a controlled safe house. He paused. I was good at it. What happened? I found out someone inside my own organization was selling protected route information. I reported it up the chain. My superiors ignored it. A week later, we ran a transfer on a route that had been compromised. 2 of my team didn't come home. Sabrina looked at him steadily, with pity, with something more attentive than that. I was cleared of any negligence, he continued. Took 18 months, a formal review board, and a congressional inquiry into the broader leak. Cleared. He said it flatly, the way you say something you have said many times, in many rooms and used to many people, and that has never entirely stopped needing to be said. Cleared and functional aren't the same thing. I left, and your daughter's mother? A beat. She died 2 years ago. Cancer. We'd known for a while. He said it, the way he always said it when it had to be said briefly. Jeet directly, without embellishment. Because embellishment was for when you had the emotional bandwidth to navigate someone else's response, and right now he did not. Was 6. It's been the 2 of us since. Sabrina nodded. Just once. Small. Go, she said. He went. The maintenance access panel was at the end of the administrative corridor behind the security station, a metal door the size of a standard cabinet, secured with a hex bolt that took him 40 seconds with the small multi-tool he kept in his jacket's interior pocket. Inside, a shaft roughly 3 feet wide, running vertically with ladder rungs, welded to the near wall, and horizontal branches at each floor that connected to the HVAC distribution network. 4 floors up. Not comfortable as advertised. The metal was cold, and the air inside the shaft carried smells of industrial lubricant and old dust. His ribs registered every rung. The cut above his cheekbone throbbed steadily. The 42nd floor branch. He found the second floor branch. He found the access point floor's mechanical space, a crawl space above the drop ceiling tiles that ran the length of the executive suite corridor. He moved through it slowly, on his forearms redistributing his weight carefully across the ceiling supports. One wrong foot through a tile, and whatever advantage he had evaporated. He found a vent grate above the corridor near the suite entrance and looked through. Victor was visible at the end of the corridor, back to Nolan, speaking to one of the 2 men who'd ridden up with him. The suite door was open. Inside, Nolan could see 3 people seated on the low furniture hotel staff, from the uniforms, hands visible, complying. A 4th person stood in the corner, a woman in event coordinator's clothing, her headset still around her neck, expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who has decided that being visibly terrified will make things worse. An execution setup, a holding arrangement, Victor wanted leverage, not casualties, which meant he hadn't given up on the original plan. He still thought there was a version of tonight where he came out intact. That meant he thought Sabrina was still in the building and still findable. Watched for another 2 minutes, cataloging the positions, the angles, the layout of the suite beyond the open door. Victor's 2 men were positioned at the suite entrance and at the far end of the corridor, respectively, covering both approaches. Standard 2-point coverage. Effective against someone coming directly. Effective against someone already above them. Victor's phone rang. He answered it, listened, and what moved across his face in the next 15 seconds was not the expression of a man receiving good news. His jaw tightened. He said something short and sharp that Nolan couldn't fully make out through the vent, but the word at the end of it was a name. Beckett. Nolan went very still. Someone had identified him. Someone in Victor's network. Possibly someone who'd run his name through a background system. Possibly the security chief who'd dismissed his concerns 2 hours ago and would know exactly who Marcus Webb had referred for this assignment. Victor ended the call. He turned and spoke to the man nearest him. Caught 3 words clearly. Find him first. Victor walked into the executive suite and closed the door. The man in the corridor started moving not toward the elevator bank, not toward the main stairwell, toward the administrative section, toward the 38th floor, toward Sabrina. Nolan turned around in the crawl space and moved back the way he'd come, no longer worrying about the ceiling tiles. The descent through the shaft was faster and significantly less careful than the ascent. No. He hit the 38th floor access door, pushed through, and was in the administrative corridor in under 3 minutes. He crossed to the security station, knocked twice, then once. Silence. He knocked again. It's me. Open the door. Pause that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. The sound of the lock turning. She opened the door and looked at him. Behind her, the hardwired phone handset was resting off the hook on the desk. The hotel operator's hold music, playing tinnily into the empty room. Someone's coming, he said. I know, she said. I heard them on the stairs a minute ago. I didn't open the door. She held his gaze. I trusted you. He didn't have time to respond to that in any way that would do it justice. So he stepped into the room, checked the door's lock, and began thinking very quickly about the 38th floor's layout and what he had available to work with and how long they had before Victor's man reached this corridor. The answer to the last question came from the stairwell door at the end of the hall, the sound of it opening. Looked at Sabrina. She looked at him. Neither of them was in a position that anyone would describe as ideal. Had no weapon, a bruised rib situation, a cut on his face that was going to need stitches. Yes, he'd intervened, and approximately 40 feet and a locked door between them and someone who had been sent to find them. She was in a designer dress and heels, in a utility corridor on the 38th floor of a hotel where someone had tried to shoot her 2 hours ago. How are you with improvisation? He asked. She picked up the heavy metal stapler from the desk and held it at her side. I've been told I'm creative under pressure. Good, Nolan said. Because here's what we're going to do. The footsteps in the corridor were 12 feet from the door. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Had positioned himself flat against the wall, to the left of the door frame, the hinge side, not the handle side, which put him in the blind spot that most people forget exists when they're entering a room they expect to control. Sabrina was across from him, back against the desk. The metal stapler in her right hand held low, raised. Raised was theatrical. Low was functional. She'd understood that without being told. The door handle moved, tested, locked. A pause, then a knock, 3 sharp, even strikes. The knock of someone who didn't particularly care whether you came to the door willingly, but was giving you the option as a professional courtesy before they moved to the next approach. Neither of them made a sound. Another pause. Longer. The sound of something metal against the lock, not a key, something thinner. Pick or a tension tool, and Nolan tightened against the wall and counted seconds in his head because counting was useful when your body was trying to replace rational thought with adrenaline. The lock turned. The door pushed open slowly, because whoever was on the other side was not careless, and swept past the hinges, past Nolan pressed flat into the wall, past the narrow gap where he stood holding his breath and waiting. The man stepped through the doorway and saw Sabrina first. Was the whole plan. Not elegant, not a sequence of perfectly calibrated moves. Just the oldest misdirection in the world. Give them something to look at on the far side of the room and be on the near side when they do. Came off the wall. He got his left arm around the man's throat from behind, before the man fully registered that the room had two occupants. What followed was not a clean submission. The man was trained, and he reacted fast, driving his elbow back hard and catching Nolan in the same ribs that had already been complaining since the second floor. And the pain was significant enough that Nolan's grip broke partially, and he had to reset. They turned together in the small space, knocking into the desk, sending the phone handset clattering to the floor, the hold music cutting out with a plastic clatter. Sabrina moved, not away, toward. She came around the desk on the man's right side, and she did not hesitate in the way that most people hesitate when violence is immediate and present and real, rather than theoretical. She brought the stapler down hard on the man's right forearm, the arm that was reaching back toward the holster at his hip, and the sound it made was not the sound effects from films. It was duller and more solid, and the man's hand spasmed and lost what it was reaching for. The gun hit the floor. Nolan got his arm back into position. The man fought it for 12 seconds, which is a long time when you're counting, and then the fight went out of him in the specific gradual way that meant he'd lost consciousness rather than given up, which was safer for everyone. Lowered him to the floor. His ribs were making a serious argument for taking a moment. He didn't take one. Sabrina was looking at the gun on the floor. "Pick it up," Nolan said. He was breathing harder than he wanted to be. "Hold it with two hands. Barrel down, finger outside the trigger guard. You don't point it at anything. You're not willing to damage." She picked it up, adjusted her grip. Her hands were not entirely steady, but her jaw was set and she didn't look at him for reassurance, which he respected. "Have you ever fired one?" he asked. "My father took me to a range twice. I was 17 and I hated it, and I never went back." "That's fine. You're not going to fire it if we can avoid it. It's a visual deterrent, right?" She looked at the gun, then at the man on the floor. "Wake up. In a few minutes." Nolan was already moving, pulling the man's jacket off, using the sleeves to secure his wrists to the leg of the steel desk in a way that would hold long enough. It wasn't professional-grade restraint. It was time, bought in increments. "That's why we're not staying." He straightened, looked at her, looked at the gun in her hands, the state of her dress, the cut on her forearm that had dried to a thin dark line, the careful steadiness she was maintaining by what was visibly a concentrated act of will. 2.5 hours ago, she had looked at his fraying suit cuff and decided he wasn't worth taking seriously. He didn't think about that. Not now. Maybe not ever he'd cross that. Whenever they got out of this building, if they got out of this building, and the if was still a real if, and he knew it. "We're going up," he said. She looked at him. "You said 42 was Victor's position." "It is. So we're going toward the man who wants me dead. We're going toward the man who has 4 hotel employees in a suite on the 42nd floor, who has at least one other person in this building still looking for us, who, based on what I heard from the maintenance shaft, has just been told his primary timeline has collapsed." Nolan moved to the door, checked the corridor. Empty. A man whose plan is falling apart makes different decisions than a man who thinks he's in control. He's going to want to consolidate. Either he takes what he has and runs, or he reaches for something keen that gives him leverage. The hostages on 42 are the most obvious leverage he has left. Sabrina was quiet for a beat. "If I surrender to him." "I wasn't asking your permission. I was thinking out loud." Her voice had an edge, not an angry one, more the edge of someone doing math under pressure. "If he has me, he doesn't need the hostages. He releases them and has 1 problem instead of 5. He releases them because they become witnesses he'd rather not have. Then he has 1 problem and 0 complications. You're not surrendering to him." "You sound very certain about that." I am very certain about that. She studied him for a moment, and something passed across her face that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite challenge something in between. The look of someone deciding whether to trust a judgment that is being offered without equivocation, in a situation where equivocation would be easier. All right, she said. Then we do it your way. He told her the plan as they moved. It wasn't a complex plan. Complex plans had too many moving parts, and moving parts failed under pressure, and they were already under enough pressure that adding more variables was not something he was willing to do. What he had was simple: the maintenance shaft back up to 42, the ceiling crawl space, and the specific piece of information he'd gathered while he was up there the first time. Victor, in telling the man nearest him to find him first, had turned his back on the suite door for exactly the duration of that short conversation. And in doing so, he'd shown Nolan something that Victor probably didn't think anyone was positioned to see: the layout of the suite's interior, the placement of the 4 hostages, and the fact that Victor's second man, the one covering the far end of the corridor, had been called inside when Victor's phone rang, leaving the corridor temporarily uncovered. Temporarily, but even temporary became permanent if you were in the ceiling before the coverage reset. Explain this to Sabrina in the stairwell, climbing, her dress making quiet sound against the concrete wall at each turning of the landing. What do you need me to do? She asked. I need Victor's attention on the suite door for 60 seconds. Enough time for me to get into position above the room. I'll handle his remaining man. Victor, you leave to me. And how do I get his attention on the door from inside a ventilation shaft? You stay in the shaft, at the access point, 1 floor above. When I give you the signal, what's the signal? The fire alarm. She stopped climbing. I thought the fire alarm was disabled. The main system is in test mode. The manual pull stations on each floor are on a separate circuit they're required to be, by city code, for exactly this reason. There's a pull station at the top of the stairwell on 42. When you see me enter the shaft, you count 60 seconds, then you pull it. She started climbing again. And then Victor has a decision to make: the alarm or the door, and whichever one he chooses, I'll be in the room before he's finished making it. That's not a great plan. It's the plan we have. A beat, 2 more steps. Okay, she said. They reached 42 via the shaft without encountering anyone. Either Victor's search span had extended downward, or the man Sabrina had hit with a stapler had been the only one sent in this direction. And his failure to check in was raising questions that hadn't yet translated into redeployment. Moved through the crawl space above the executive suite corridor, with Sabrina directly behind him. Slower now, both of them hyper-conscious of the ceiling tiles. Through the vent grate, the corridor looked the same as when he'd left it. Victor's remaining visible man was back at the suite entrance, standing rather than sitting, posture more alert than it had been 30 minutes ago. Something had made him edgy. The absence of the man sent to 38, probably. When you send someone and they don't come back and they don't check in, you start performing uncomfortable arithmetic. The suite door was closed. Nolan pointed at the pull station, a red handle mounted on the corridor wall, 12 feet from the suite door, 6 feet from the ceiling access panel he was going to use. Pointed at Sabrina and held up 1 finger. He found this access panel. Worked the retaining clips one at a time. Slow. No noise. The panel came loose. He looked back at her. She was counting. He could tell not visibly. The count was internal. But her lips were barely moving in the way they do when you're holding a number. He waited till she was at around 30. He was estimating based on the rhythm of it, and then he descended through the access panel into the corridor. The man at the suite turned. The man at the suite door turned. They looked at each other, the particular suspension of a moment where both parties are recalculating. The man was faster off the starting line than Nolan would have preferred, and he had a significant size advantage, and Nolan's ribs had now been providing a running commentary on his life choices for the past 90 minutes. But then the fire alarm went off, not the building-wide emergency cascade that would have come from the main system. Just the 42nd floor pull station, local and immediate, the specific sound of a manual alarm station engaged, piercing and insistent in the enclosed corridor space. The man's eyes went to the ceiling reflex, the way everyone looks up at sudden loud noise. A fraction of a second, involuntary and nearly universal. Crossed the distance. He'd fought tired before. He'd fought hurt before. Neither was a situation he recommended. Both were situations he'd survived. And the way you survived them was not by ignoring the pain, but by using it, letting it sharpen your focus. Letting the body's alarm system work for you instead of against you. The man was bigger and fresher and had better equipment. Had 12 years of knowing exactly where to put pressure to end a fight in the shortest possible time. It was not fast. It was not clean. He took a knee to the thigh that numbed his left leg from the hip down for about 15 seconds, which was alarming, and a blow to the shoulder that sent white sparks across his vision. But he got the man's weapon hand-controlled, got his weight applied to the correct joint in the correct direction, and when the man went down, Nolan made sure he stayed there in a way that would last. He was on his feet, and at the suite door when it opened from the inside. Victor Langley stood in the doorway. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, the kind of man who had spent decades being the most composed person in every room he entered. He was dressed in a dark suit, correctly cut, correctly fitted, the kind of suit that cost what Nolan's apartment cost per month. He was holding a gun, and it was pointed at Nolan's chest, and his hand was steady. But his eyes weren't. Behind him, visible over his shoulder, the 4 hotel employees seated against the far wall. The event coordinator, still standing in the corner. All of them staring at the door. "Mr. Beckett," Victor said. His voice was even, the voice of someone who is prepared for this contingency and is working the preparation. "You're more persistent than I anticipated. I've heard that before," Nolan said. He didn't move, didn't look at the gun. Looking at the gun was what people did when the gun was the most important thing in the room, and right now the most important thing in the room was Victor's eyes and the calculation moving behind them. "You've put yourself in an exceptionally difficult position," Victor said. "I was in a difficult position when I walked in here tonight. I figure we're about even." Victor studied him. "Where is she?" "I don't know, Mr. Beckett." "I don't know," Nolan said again. And the useful thing about that answer was that it was true. He had told Sabrina to stay in the ceiling at the access point 1 floor above. Where she was at this exact moment, he genuinely did not know, which meant the answer came out with the specific texture of a true statement, and not the texture of a lie. And Victor, who had spent his career learning to read people across boardroom tables, heard it. His eyes shifted, reassessing. "Here's what I know about you," Nolan said, "because the best thing you can do with a man who is calculating is give him more to calculate. Keep him in his head, not in his hands. 14 years at Halstead Industries. You were there when the company was small. You watched it grow. You helped build it, and somewhere in that 14 years, you started pulling money out of it. Shell corporations probably started small. Maybe you told yourself it was temporary. Maybe you told yourself you'd earned it. No." Victor's jaw tightened. "Not much. Enough. The amount you've taken," Nolan continued, "it's substantial enough that when Sabrina signed the $600 million contract, the automatic audit it triggered would have found it. You needed 2 things. You needed her dead before the signing, and you needed to be in position to control the company afterward. That's a compelling narrative," Victor said. His voice was still controlled, but the control was costing him more than it had 30 seconds ago. "Contract isn't just money," Nolan said. "The access it grants city infrastructure, emergency signal networks. Someone wants that access, and they're willing to pay enough for it that killing a 30-year-old woman seemed like an acceptable operational cost." Somewhere in the suite, a phone vibrated against a hard surface. Victor didn't look at it. "Whoever's calling you," Nolan said, "I'm going to guess they're not happy with how the evening has gone." "Get on your knees," Victor said. No, a pause. In Nolan's experience, when someone told you to get on your knees and you refused, one of 2 things happened. They revealed that they weren't fully prepared to make you. The several seconds that followed his refusal were Victor working out which category he fell into. In those seconds, Nolan was watching the trigger finger. He'd been watching it since the suite door opened. The finger was outside the guard, disciplined, trained, but the knuckle was white, which meant pressure, and pressure meant the decision to fire had been made in the abstract, but not yet fully committed to in the physical. There was still a gap between thinking and doing, and that gap was the only thing Nolan had to work with. Victor Sabrina's voice, from the doorway of the suite, from the corridor behind Nolan. She had come down. Nolan did not look at her. He kept his eyes on Victor, on the finger, on the calculation behind the eyes. Vict looked at Sabrina. And what moved across his face in that moment was something Nolan hadn't expected, something complicated and genuine. The face of a man who has convinced himself completely of a version of events in which he is not the villain, encountering the specific person who destroys that version simply by being alive and standing there. His voice changed, not softer, exactly. Rawer, you were supposed to, this was not, I know what I was supposed to do, she said. Her voice was level. She had come into the doorway and she had the gun from the 38th floor in her hand, and her hand was shaking visibly. And she did not try to hide that it was shaking, because the shaking was real, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of performance. Exactly what I was supposed to do tonight, Victor. You planned it very carefully. It wasn't. He stopped. Something happened in his expression. The particular fracture of a man who has been arguing with himself for months about a thing he's decided to do and hasn't resolved it as cleanly as he told himself he had. Company was going to be taken from you anyway. The board was moving, don't, she said quietly. The contract negotiations, the pressure from the federal side. You were going to lose it, Sabrina. Your father's company. You were trying to steal from it and cover it up, and you couldn't cover it up anymore. Her voice didn't rise. Just went more specific, more exact. The way you get when you've stopped being polite, because polite is no longer the correct tool. And you decided I was easier to remove than the evidence. Victor's trigger finger moved, not firing shifting. The gun dropping slightly. The barrel angling down from Nolan's chest toward the floor. The movement of a man whose certainty is failing him in real time, who is discovering that the version of events he constructed in his head is not surviving contact with the actual people involved. And in that fraction of a second, when the barrel dropped and Victor's eyes were on Sabrina and his trigger finger was in the wrong position, and the gap between thinking and doing was at its widest. Lunged. He came in low and fast, driving off his right leg, because his left was still not entirely cooperative, getting his hands on Victor's gun hand before Victor could recalibrate, forcing the weapon up and away from anything that mattered. The gun discharged, the sound was enormous in the enclosed space, a white crack of sound and pressure. Round went into the ceiling, raining plaster down on both of them, and then Nolan had the wrist in the lock that ended it, and Victor was going down, not gracefully, quietly. The composed 61-year-old executive hitting the suite floor with the full weight of a man whose plan has just collapsed in every direction simultaneously. Got the gun. He stood up. His left leg was functioning again, barely. His ribs were providing constant editorial commentary. Cut on his face had reopened during the lunge, and he could feel it bleeding again. He looked at Victor on the floor. Victor was not unconscious. He'd hit his shoulder rather than his head, and he was looking up at the ceiling with the expression of a man doing a comprehensive accounting of everything that has happened to him, everything he's chosen, arriving at numbers he doesn't want to look at. Behind Nolan, Sabrina had moved into the room. He heard her speaking to the hostages, her voice clear and careful, telling them it was over, telling them the police were in the building, telling them to stay in the room. The event coordinator who'd been standing in the corner had started crying, which was fine. Crying meant processing. Processing meant functional. Crouched down next to Victor. Victor turned his head and looked at him. The building infrastructure access, Nolan said quietly. Who's the buyer? Victor said nothing. You can tell me now, or you tell it to federal investigators for the next 18 months, Nolan said. But they'll find it either way. The shell corporations, the financial transfers, The communication trail, they'll find it. What you decide right now is whether you were the man who built the thing or the man who also helped dismantle it. Victor looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Carver Group, he said finally. Private infrastructure acquisition firm. They've been buying access rights to mid-tier city systems in 6 states. Chicago was the largest. The transportation contract was their entry point. Filed it. How long have you been working with them? 2 years. Did Sabrina's father know? A pause. Long enough to contain something. No, Victor said. Stood up. He crossed the room to where Sabrina was standing, her back to Victor, facing the hostages, the 4 hotel employees who were gradually moving from the seated compliance of fear into the slightly bewildered mobility of people who've been released from a situation they didn't fully understand. He stood beside her and said nothing for a moment. She said nothing either. Outside, through the suite's tall windows, Chicago spread out below them, the lights of Michigan Avenue, the dark spread of the lake, the city going about the version of Friday night that hadn't involved gunfire and ventilation shafts, and a 30-year-old billionaire lying on a marble floor next to an ice sculpture, while a single father tried to keep her alive. Carver Group, Nolan said. She turned. What? The buyer. People Victor was working with. Carver Group. Federal infrastructure acquisition scheme across 6 states. Want to give that name to the investigators directly and specifically. He paused. Let anyone else be the first person who says it in that room. You say it. She looked at him. Why are you telling me that? Because it's your company, and because the way this information gets introduced matters for what happens next. You control the narrative, or it controls you. Something moved in her face. Gratitude, exactly. Recognition, the specific look of someone hearing a thing they already knew, but hadn't fully articulated yet. From the stairwell at the end of the corridor, the sound of boots on concrete. More than 2 sets. Moving fast, coordinated, the specific rhythm of law enforcement tactical movement. Straightened, he set Victor's gun on the floor at his feet and raised both hands to shoulder height, not because he was uncertain of his own situation. Because walking out of a room where a shooting had occurred and a man was on the floor was a moment where clarity of intent was worth communicating early and without ambiguity. Chicago PD, he said, addressing the door, raising his voice enough to carry. Beckett, independent security consultant. The shooter is on the floor, disarmed. 4 civilian hostages present uninjured, 1 suspect in custody. The door came open. 3 officers entered fast, weapon forward, doing the room in the practiced sequence of people trained to clear spaces. They read the scene, Nolan's hands up, Sabrina standing, Victor on the floor, hostages against the wall, hostages, and the immediate tension of entry shifted by degrees into the more manageable tension of a scene that needed processing. The lead officer, a woman in her 40s, with the bearing of someone who'd been doing this long enough that very little surprised her, looked at Nolan, at Sabrina, at the gun on the floor, at Victor. Who's who, she said. He's the subject, Nolan said, indicating Victor. She's the target of the original attack, Sabrina Halstead. I was hired as independent security for tonight's event. The officer looked at Sabrina. You all right? I'm all right, Sabrina said. Her voice was steady. I have information about a broader criminal network that I need to provide to the appropriate investigators as soon as possible. Carver Group, CARVER, federal scope. I need to say that to the right person before anyone else does. Officer looked at her for a moment. The officer looked at attention of someone recalibrating who exactly they're looking at. Okay, she said. Let's get you downstairs. They moved Victor first in cuffs, 2 officers with him. The hostages followed, the event coordinator still crying quietly. One of the hotel staff supporting another who'd twisted an ankle at some point during the ordeal. Sabrina went with the lead officer. Nolan was the last one out of the suite. In the doorway, he stopped for a moment. The suite was wrecked in the specific way of places where things have happened, furniture displaced, plaster dust on the floor, the ceiling damaged where the gun had discharged. Victor's phone was still on the low table where he'd set it, screen dark. Outside the tall windows, Chicago was indifferent and continuous, the way cities are. The way they go on, regardless of whatever is happening in any particular room, on any particular floor. Looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the window. The gray suit was in poor condition. The jacket had a tear at the shoulder seam. The left cuff that he'd tried to fold was now unfolded, the fraying visible. Cut on his face had stopped bleeding at some point, but the dried blood tracked down his cheekbone in a way that he knew from experience would look worse under decent lighting. His tie was gone. He wasn't sure exactly when he'd lost it. Somewhere in the maintenance shaft, probably, or the corridor struggle. He looked at the tie clip, still attached to his collar. The silver one with the B on the back. He unclipped it and held it in his hand for a second. Small, light, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it meant. Claire had given it to him in December, 14 years ago, and she'd said, "So you have something of mine when I'm not there to behave yourself." Pocketed it. Then he walked out of the suite and toward the elevator, where a police officer was waiting to bring him down to the lobby, down to the questions and the statements and the long administrative work of a night that had started with a second-hand suit, and a warning nobody wanted to hear. In the lobby, through the glass front of the Harrington Grand, he could see Michigan Avenue busy with blue and red light. He could see the street full of people, guests who'd gotten out, bystanders, police, paramedics. The city's response to a thing that had happened in its middle, loud and organized and present. He stopped in the lobby and pulled out his phone. The signal was back. The jamming equipment had been found and disabled. He'd learned later that it had been in a maintenance closet on the 16th floor. That sophisticated hardware that took the technical team 40 minutes to fully shut down. He had 3 missed calls from his mother-in-law, all within the last hour. And one text from Lily, sent at 8:47, which read, "Grandma says something happened downtown and I told her. You were working downtown and she got worried. You okay?" He'd back, "I'm okay. Tell her I'm okay. I'll call when I can. Go to sleep if it's late. Love you." Put the phone back in his pocket. The lead officer appeared from the elevator and gestured toward the south side of the lobby, where a makeshift command post had been set up, folding tables, uniformed and plainclothes officers, someone from the federal level based on the jacket. Yet, a long night of questions waiting. Across the lobby, through the crowd of people moving toward the command post, Sabrina Halstead was sitting on a low bench. There was a blanket around her shoulders that someone had provided, though she hadn't pulled it tight. An officer was with her, but she wasn't looking at the officer. She was looking at Nolan. He crossed the lobby toward her, because that was the direction they were both going anyway. Because there were things that needed to be said at some point, and the lobby of a hotel at 10:30 at night surrounded by mall police was not the correct setting for any of them, but some acknowledgements didn't wait for the correct setting. He stopped in front of her. She looked up at him from the bench. Tired, genuinely tired, in the way that doesn't perform itself, the tiredness of a person who has held themselves together across several hours of sustained fear and is now in a place where slightly less of that effort is required. Careful composure was still there, but it was carrying more of its own weight now. "Your tie is gone," she said. "Maintenance shaft," he said. She nodded once, the way she nodded when she was cataloging a piece of information and moving past it. "Clip. Is it still? It's in my pocket." She exhaled, something that wasn't quite a sigh and not quite relief. "I need to give a very long statement to a lot of people." "So do I. Carver Group is going to have lawyers filed against this city by morning." "Probably. And Victor's going to say I knew about the shell corporations." "He'll try to flip the narrative." "He'll try," Nolan said. "He won't manage it. The financial trail goes where it goes, and it doesn't point at you." She looked at him steadily. "How are you certain of that?" "Because if it pointed at you, they wouldn't have needed you dead. They just would have arrested you." A pause. She looked at her hands for a moment. Back at him. "I said something tonight," she said, in front of a room full of people. "About your suit." She stopped. "You don't have to." "I do, actually." The words were precise, measured. Performance of apology, the real thing, with the specific discomfort of a person who is not accustomed to being wrong and is doing it anyway because it's right. It was a cheap thing to say, and I said it because I wanted the people in that room to see that I could dismiss you, and they would accept it. That's not leadership. That's theater. She paused. I'm sorry. Nolan looked at her. Okay, he said. Okay? You apologized. I heard it. It was a real one. He shrugged, which his ribs objected to. She seemed briefly, as though she wasn't certain how to process an acceptance of apology that didn't come with either absolution or prolonged processing. Something settled in her expression, not relief, exactly, but the specific quality of a weight that has been set down. I'm going to need a completely rebuilt security division, she said. That's a significant undertaking, I know. Her eyes were direct. I also know that I didn't have the right person in that role for tonight, and that the right person was in a second-hand suit telling me to leave the room, and I didn't listen. Said nothing. An officer appeared at Sabrina's elbow to guide her toward the command post. The long process of the night's official accounting was ready to begin. She stood, pulled the blanket from her shoulders and folded it neatly, which was such a characteristically precise thing to do in the circumstances that something almost like amusement moved through the exhaustion in Nolan's chest. She was 2 feet away from him when she stopped and turned back. That thing you said, she says. Every warning will be judged by evidence, not by the clothing of the person delivering it. Say that tonight, Nolan said. No, she agreed. But you will. Then she walked toward the command post, the blanket folded over her arm, her spine straight. No. Yes, he'd intervened, and the November night pressing cold and bright against all the glass of the Harrington Grand Hotel's ruined front windows. Stood in the lobby for a moment longer. His ribs hurt. His face hurt. His left leg was making its displeasure known in a sustained and focused way. He needed stitches, food, a conversation with his daughter, in the morning over cereal, and approximately 10 hours of sleep, in roughly that order. He walked toward the command post. The questions were waiting, and he had all of the answers, and the night was not over yet. The part that required him to run through maintenance shafts and fight trained men in service corridors and stand between a billionaire and a gun held by someone she'd trusted for 14 years, that part was done. Victor Langley was in handcuffs somewhere in this building. Sabrina Halstead was alive. And Beckett, 32 years old, father of one, owner of one gray suit that had seen considerably better days, walked toward the folding tables and the federal agents and the long work of finishing what the night had started. Statement took 4 hours. Sat at a folding table in a room the hotel had cleared for investigators, a conference space on the 3rd floor that still smelled faintly of the catering from whatever event had used it that afternoon. Coffee and warm bread. The ordinary smell of an ordinary Friday that had been a different building's problem entirely. A federal agent named Reyes sat across from him, mid-40s, the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had conducted enough interviews to know that pushing produced less than waiting. A second agent typed at a laptop to the right. A recorder sat between them on the table. Walked through it from the beginning. The camera angled wrong. The exit propped open. The alarm in test mode. The man in tactical boots who never delivered a drink. The security chief's 2 smooth explanations. The red laser dot on the tablecloth. Everything that followed. Reyes listened without interrupting, which Nolan appreciated. He asked specific questions when Nolan finished each section, precise, technical questions, the kind that separated people who understood operational security from people who'd read about it. He was clearly the latter's opposite. When Nolan described the card he'd found on the floor of the East Corridor 42. Confirm position. Reyes leaned forward slightly. You still have it? No, produced it from his jacket's interior pockets, still folded. Reyes had it bagged and tagged without ceremony. Carver Group, Reyes said. You heard Langley say that name directly. Direct. 42nd floor suite. He also said the infrastructure scheme spanned 6 states, that Chicago was the largest target, and that the transportation contract was the entry point. Nolan paused. He said the scheme had been running 2 years. And he volunteered this? I gave him the choice between telling me and telling investigators for 18 months. He made a calculation. Nolan looked at the recorder. I'm aware that a statement made under so circumstances has evidentiary limitations. I'm telling you what I heard. Reyes nodded. We'll handle the evidentiary weight. You tell me what you heard. By the time they finished, it was past 2 in the morning. And stitches, 4 of them, above his cheekbone, applied by a paramedic with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd been doing field stitches since long before tonight, had begun to itch in the particular way new stitches do. His ribs had been assessed and found bruised rather than broken, which was the right result, but didn't change the way they felt. He was given a card with a number to call and told he'd be contacted within 48 hours for a follow-up session. He was also told with the careful neutrality of a federal agent delivering information that isn't technically a compliment, but functions as one. His account had been corroborated in material detail by the statements of every other witness interviewed that evening. He walked out of the Harrington Grand at 2:20 into the November cold. Michigan Avenue was quieter now, the emergency vehicles mostly gone, a few police vehicles still present, yellow tape across the hotel's east entrance. The glass facade of the second floor was boarded where the windows had been shot out, plywood pale against the dark building face. Television news van was parked across the street. A reporter was doing a stand-up to camera, gesturing toward the hotel, saying something Nolan couldn't hear. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed cold air and let his body understand that the immediate portion of the night was finished. Then he took the L home. On the train, he was the only person in his car for 3 stops. He sat with his head back against the window and looked at the ceiling and did the thing he always did in the aftermath of something hard. He went through it all again in sequence. Yes, he'd intervened, looking for the moment where he'd made the wrong call or moved too late or missed something that could have gone differently. It was not a productive habit. He'd been told that by 3 separate people over the years, including a federal counselor he'd been required to see after the internal review board. He still did it anyway because not doing it felt like the kind of willful not looking that had gotten 2 of his teammates killed. He found 3 moments where things could have gone worse than they had. He didn't find any where he'd been wrong. That was as close to okay as it got, and he knew it. He was home by 3:15. The apartment was the way he'd left it, the kitchen light on because he always left it on when he came home late, Lily's drawing still on the table where she'd abandoned it that morning, a half-empty glass of juice she was supposed to have put in the sink. He stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet. He put the juice glass in the sink. He took the silver tie clip out of his jacket pocket and set it on the counter. Looked at it for a moment in the kitchen light. Then he went to bed. He slept 6 hours, which was more than he expected. In the morning, he called his mother-in-law. She answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been awake for a while. Her name was Donna Claire's mother, a practical woman in her 60s who had processed her daughter's death by becoming more functionally present in Lily's life than she'd ever been before. Nolan had been grateful for, in ways that were difficult to articulate, because some gratitude was too large for words. She'd moved 20 minutes away 8 months after Claire died, and he'd never once heard her say that she did it for him, though they both understood that she had. I saw the news, she said. I'm okay. I know you're okay. I can hear that you're okay. I want to know if you're actually okay. Sat at the kitchen table, 4 stitches and some bruised ribs. Pause on her end. Not a disapproving pause. Donna didn't do disapproval as a primary communication mode, which was one of many reasons Nolan found her easier than most people. Just the pause of someone absorbing information and deciding what to do with it. Lily wants to know if you fought anybody, she said. Tell her I did some security work and I had a small accident. She's 8, not 4. She watched the news at breakfast before I could redirect her. There was footage of the hotel. Nolan closed his eyes briefly. Tell her I'm fine and I'll be there for dinner. She's going to ask. I'll tell her. The age-appropriate version. Their pause, then quietly. You were okay, though. It wasn't a question. It was Donna's particular way of confirming a thing without requiring him to confirm it. because she'd learned over the years that asking Nolan directly whether he was all right, and the honest answer, then simply stating a thing and letting him correct it if it needed correcting. He said, "I was okay." He picked Lily up at 4 that afternoon. She was waiting on the front steps of Donna's building when his car pulled up, coat half zipped, backpack on one shoulder, expression on her face, cycling between intense concern and the barely contained excitement of someone who has been waiting all day to ask a specific question and is trying to decide how to lead with the concern first. She got into the car and looked at his face. "That's stitches," she said. "4 of them. Did it hurt?" The paramedic was fast. She absorbed this. "Are you in trouble?" "No." "The police know what happened and why." "Did you protect someone?" He pulled away from the curb. "That was the job." "Did they say thank you?" He thought about Sabrina on the lobby bench, the blanket folded over her arm, the apology that was a real one. "She did," he said. Lily was quiet for half a block. "Dad." "Yeah, I'm glad you're okay. Me too, Bug." "Would have been really mad at you." Nolan kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah, she would have. She would have been proud too, though." After the mad part, he didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Lily seemed to understand that, the way she sometimes understood things that were bigger than 8 years old should be able to hold. And she turned to look out the window at the Chicago evening coming in. They drove home. The 48 hours after the Harrington Grand were loud in the way that the immediate aftermath of large events is loud news coverage, official statements, the grinding official machinery of multiple simultaneous investigations. Victor Langley was charged on a federal level with conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and material support for criminal enterprise, among 7 additional counts that Nolan didn't follow closely, because they were the investigators' work now, not his. The security chief, whose name was Hargrove, Dennis Hargrove, 22 years in corporate security, was arrested on the second day and charged with criminal negligence and accepting bribes to facilitate the compromised security posture. He cooperated immediately and completely, which reduced his charges somewhat, but not enough to matter much. The men Victor had brought to the hotel were identified through the evening's camera footage and physical evidence. 3 were in custody within 36 hours. A 4th was picked up in Milwaukee 8 hours later trying to board a flight. Carver Group's offices in 3 cities were the subject of federal search warrants by the following Monday. Read that in a news alert on his phone while he was making Lily's lunch, and didn't think much about it beyond noting that Reyes had moved quickly, which was the correct speed for that kind of thing. He submitted his written risk assessment to Marcus Webb, 5 pages, single-spaced, which was considerably more detailed than the assignment had called for. Marcus called him after reading it. "You know there are going to be calls," Marcus said. "Big calls. People who want to hire you. You're handling that how?" "Carefully," Nolan said. He went back to the ordinary rhythm of the week. Lily's school pickup, the grocery run, the landlord about the 2 burners. A deposition prep session for an insurance fraud case he'd been consulting on before the Harrington. He slept 7 hours 2 nights in a row, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. On the 4th day after, he received a call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer it. "Mr. Beckett, this is Halstead Industries General Counsel, Margaret Foss. I'm calling on behalf of Ms. Halstead. She'd like to arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience. She understands your time is valuable and asked me to say that the meeting is entirely at your discretion. She's not calling in any obligation." Nolan said. "Whenever suits," he said. Thursday at 10. The Halstead Industries offices were on the 3rd or 4th floor of a building, in the loop, the kind of space that communicated success without shouting about it. The design choices of people who didn't need to prove anything and had made that into an aesthetic. He arrived 7 minutes early, which was his default, and was shown into a conference room with a view of the city that on a clear Thursday morning in late November was quietly spectacular. Sabrina came in 3 minutes later. She looked different from the lobby of the Harrington Grand. Not in a superficial way, she was well-dressed, composed, professional version of the person he'd met in crisis, which was the version the world mostly saw. What was different was something harder to name, something slightly less performed about the composure, something that had been there under the surface 4 days ago and was more surface now. She had a small bandage on her forearm where the glass had cut her. She sat across from him at the conference table without the intermediary of a lawyer or an assistant, which he noted. "How are your ribs?" she asked. "Inconvenient," he said. "How's your arm?" "7 stitches. The doctor was less fast than your paramedic." A brief pause that might, in a different register, have been amusement. "I've spent 4 days in meetings with attorneys, federal investigators, and my board of directors. I suspended the transportation contract pending a completely independent external audit. The board is not uniformly happy with that decision." "What did you tell them?" "Told them that signing a major federal contract with an unaudited internal structure was how we got here, and that if they wanted to have a vote about it, they were welcome to, and that I would win that vote." She held his gaze. "I won the vote." He nodded. She opened the folder in front of her, the action of someone who has prepared for a meeting and takes the preparation seriously, which tracked with everything he'd observed about her. "I'd like to offer you a position," she said. "Executive Director of Independent Security and Risk. It's a new division, nothing like it currently exists within the company structure, which is part of what allowed the vulnerability that Victor exploited. The division would operate with structural independence from the main corporate hierarchy. Budget authority, staffing authority, direct reporting line to me and to the board's oversight committee, bypassing all intermediate executive layers." She named a salary. Nolan kept his expression even, but it took a small effort. The number was not what people offered independent security consultants working Friday evening risk assessments for $500 flat. She said, "It's office space here or remote, your preference. Flexible as I understand, you have a daughter in school." He looked at the folder in front of her. "Can I see the proposed charter?" She slid it across without hesitation. He read it, all of it, which took 8 minutes, during which Sabrina sat across from him without filling the silence, which he appreciated. She was good at silence in the way that people are good at it when they learn that silence costs less than noise. Charter was thoughtfully constructed. The independence provisions were genuine, not performative. They had legal teeth, not just organizational language. The reporting structure was clean. The budget authority was real. He set it down. "I won't take the title," he said. She looked at him. "Executive Director is a corporate title. Corporate titles come with corporate politics. I've watched what corporate politics does to independent judgment. It was a version of that problem that put 2 of my teammates in the ground 8 years ago." He kept his voice level, accusatory, just factual. "I'll take the role. I'll take the charter as written. I'll take the salary because I have a daughter and a 2-burner stove, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He paused. "But I want the division listed simply as independent security and risk. Executive prefix. No place in the org chart hierarchy. A separate box." Sabrina looked at the charter for a moment. "The board will push back on the structure," she said. That's why the charter needs a provision that the division's findings and recommendations are report on simultaneously to you and to the oversight committee, with a mandatory 48-hour acknowledgement requirement before any recommendation can be formally tabled. Creates an accountability loop that makes it very uncomfortable to ignore a warning. She looked at him steadily. "You've thought about this." "I've had 4 days and 2 burners. Something crossed her face. That thing that wasn't quite a smile, a movement at the corner of her mouth that contained the acknowledgement of something, without fully committing to an expression. "I'll add the provision," she said. "The 48-hour acknowledgement. I'll take it to the board. And one more thing. Go ahead. The guiding principle of the division, the thing that governs how every finding and every recommendation is evaluated. I want it stated explicitly in the charter. Implied. Written. What principle? Every warning is judged by evidence," Nolan said. "By the wealth, title, clothing, social position of the person delivering it. By whether the person delivering it is someone you like or someone with the right background or someone your board approves of. By evidence. The conference room was quiet. Outside Chicago was gray and cold and completely indifferent to anything happening on the 34th floor. Sabrina looked at the charter, then at him. That's the principle that was violated 4 days ago, she said. When I ignored you. It's the principle that was violated 8 years ago when my superiors ignored me, he said. I've been thinking about it for 8 years. I'd like it written down somewhere official. She picked up her pen. She wrote it into the charter, in the section on evaluation methodology, in her own handwriting, in the margin, clearly and without pausing to wordcraft it. She signed the page and slid it back to him. He looked at what she'd written. Close to what he'd said. Not identical. She'd made it slightly more formal, slightly more institutional. The way you have to when you're writing something into a legal document, rather than saying it across a conference room table. The substance was there, unchanged, the thing he'd spent 8 years believing, and had never had the authority to require anyone else to believe. He signed the charter. There's something else, she said, when he'd put the pen down. She reached into the folder and produced a small item, set it on the table between them without comment. It was a silver tie clip. No, the one that had gone missing, somewhere in the chaos of the Harrington Grand, in the maintenance shaft, probably, or the ceiling crawl space, or the 42nd floor struggle. He hadn't realized it was gone until he'd checked his jacket pocket the morning after and found it empty, and he'd filed it in the category of things lost in difficult nights and tried not to think about what it meant that he'd lost that particular thing. He looked at it on the table. The hotel's maintenance team found it in the access shaft on the 38th floor during the post-incident structural assessment, Sabrina said. They logged it as recovered property. My office requested it be held. Picked it up, turned it over. The B was on the back, exactly where it had always been, the engraving worn slightly soft at the edges from years of handling, but still clearly legible. How did you know it was mine? He asked. I noticed it the night we met, she said, when you were telling me to leave the room, and I wasn't listening. I noticed the clip specifically because everything else about your outfit was functional. Clip was personal. It had been handled a lot. It meant something. She paused. I filed it away as information at the time without knowing what to do with it. Later it seemed important to make sure it came back to you. Held the clip in his hand for a moment. He thought about Claire, briefly, the way he always thought about her, not the long sustained version of grief, which came at other times, at night mostly, the shorter specific version that arrived when something reminded him of the specific person she was, precise, attentive, the kind of person who noticed what things meant to people. Thank you, he said. You're welcome. He clipped it back onto his collar, which he was not wearing a tie with today. He'd worn a button-down shirt and a jacket, no tie, because the Harrington Grand experience had reminded him that he owned one tie, and it was currently somewhere in a ventilation shaft, and the clip sat against the collar button slightly incorrectly, but it was back where it belonged. Sabrina watched him do this without making it a moment, which was the correct response. When can you start? She said. After the holidays, he said. Lily has a school break in 3 weeks, and I've promised her a trip somewhere that is not Chicago in December. I'll need those 2 weeks. Where are you taking her? She wants to see snow that isn't gray. Sabrina looked briefly puzzled. Chicago has gray snow, he said, within about 48 hours of it landing. She wants white snow. Mountains. She's been researching it. How old did you say she was? 8. 8-year-olds research trips? This one does. He gathered the charter. She takes things seriously. Something in Sabrina's expression shifted not dramatically, just the small movement of a person receiving information about someone they haven't met and finding it interesting. She sounds like her father. He looked at her. That's a compliment, she said. Flat, clear, not embellished. I know, he said. He stood. She stood. They were on the same side of the conference table for a moment. The way you end up when a meeting concludes, and both people are moving toward the same door. And the distance between them was the normal distance of professional and acquaintance, and neither of them adjusted it. The press conference is tomorrow, she said. I'll be making a statement about the attack, the contract suspension, the internal investigation. I'd like to mention the division. Go ahead. I'm also going to mention that a warning was delivered that I failed to act on quickly enough and that the division is a structural response to that failure. She looked at him directly. I'm not going to name you without your consent, but I'm going to be specific about what the failure was. He considered this for a moment. You don't have to do that. I don't have to. Her voice was precise. I'm doing it because the board needs to hear it, because the people who run companies need to hear it, and because the person who issued the warning deserves to have the failure acknowledged publicly. No. A pause. Also because if I'm going to write it into a charter, I should be willing to say it in public, or the charter is theater. Nodded. Name me or don't, he said, either way. I'll name the principal, she said. Not you, unless you change your mind. He didn't change his mind. He took the elevator down through 34 floors of Halstead Industries and walked out into the loop at 11:15 on a Thursday morning in late November. The cold was the functional kind, not the painful kind, and the streets had the particular mid-morning quality of a city that has been working for 3 hours already and has 3 more before lunch. Delivery trucks and commuters and someone selling hot nuts from a cart on the corner whose smell managed to reach him from 20 feet. He walked 2 blocks before he stopped and called Marcus. You heard, Marcus said before Nolan had said anything beyond his name. Calls. I told you there would be calls. I've had 7 in 4 days. Security firms, a pharmaceutical company, 1 call from someone whose title I'm still trying to figure out. A pause. And I'm guessing you just came from Halstead. How'd you know? Because she called me to verify your background 3 days ago. I told her everything she'd want to know and a few things she didn't ask, but should have. Like what? Like the fact that you've turned down 3 positions in the last 2 years because the hours didn't work around Lily's schedule. Thoughts he'd tease. I thought she should know what she was competing with before she made an offer. Stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Marcus, you'd have done the same. Which was true, and they both knew it, so Nolan let it go. Took the position, he said. A beat. Good. With conditions. Course with conditions. What were they? Nolan told him about the charter, the principle, the 48-hour acknowledgement requirement. Marcus was quiet for a moment when he finished. Then, you know what that is, right? What you just built. Security division. It's the thing you tried to build 8 years ago inside the federal program and couldn't, Marcus said. Because you didn't have the authority to require anyone to listen. Was quiet. Now you do, Marcus said. He hadn't framed it that way, exactly. He'd been thinking about Lily's stability, about meaningful work, about a charter that said the right things in legally binding language. He hadn't been thinking about 8 years ago as something he was correcting, because he'd told himself a long time ago that the past was not a problem you corrected. It was a thing that had happened and that you carried differently over time. Marcus wasn't wrong. Yeah, Nolan said. I guess I do. He got off the phone at the corner of Michigan and Randolph and stood for a moment where he was. Press conference happened the next morning. No. He watched it on his laptop at the kitchen table while Lily was at school. Sabrina stood at a podium, a different podium, in Halstead Industries' own press room, the shattered one at the Harrington Grand, and she was precise and clear and took full questions, which a lot of executives in her position would not have done 2 weeks after a murder attempt at a major company event. She described the attack. She described the internal investigation. She described the contract suspension and the external audit. She described Victor Langley's position and what the evidence showed he had done over 14 years. And her voice when she said that was even and factual and gave nothing away of what it cost her to say it, which Nolan thought was an act of significant discipline for a person who'd known that man since before she was old enough to run a company. Then she said, the events of November 14th also revealed a failure within my own leadership. A warning was delivered that evening regarding the security posture of that event. Warning was not taken seriously when it was delivered, because I made a judgment about the person delivering it based on appearance rather than evidence. That judgment was wrong. and it was the kind of wrong that could have been catastrophic in a way that is difficult to fully articulate. She paused. The company will be establishing an independent security and risk division, operating with full structural independence from the main executive hierarchy. The division's mandate will include a specific provision that I want to read verbatim, because I've found that things you don't say out loud have a way of remaining theoretical. She read the charter language, the principle about evidence, hint about warnings, about the irrelevance of wealth and title and clothing in evaluating the validity of a concern. A reporter asked who had delivered the warning. Sabrina said an independent security consultant hired to assess the event. The assessment was accurate in every material detail. Failure was entirely on my end. The reporter pressed for a name. Sabrina said he asked for the work to speak for itself, rather than his name. Think that's the point. Nolan closed the laptop. He sat at the kitchen table for a moment in the mid-morning quiet of the apartment. The 2 burners he used sat on the stove looking exactly the same as they always had. Lily's drawing from last week was still half finished on the table. The water stain on the ceiling above the hallway still looked like a dog. He picked up the silver tie clip from where he'd left it on the counter that morning. He thought about what Marcus had said, about what he'd built and what it actually was. He thought of Claire, who would have had an exact opinion about all of it and would have delivered that opinion without softening it, because softening things was not how she operated. She would have said something like, "It took you long enough," and the ribs were unnecessary, and she would have been right on both counts. Thought about Lily, who was at school right now and didn't know that her father had spent the last 4 days arranging a version of his professional life that would let him be home when she got off the bus, that would give him the kind of work that used what he knew instead of filing it away, and that had written into its legal founding documents the one thing he'd believed for 8 years and never had the authority to require. Every warning is judged by evidence, nothing else. He set the tie clip down. He picked up his phone and texted Lily's school to confirm pickup at 3:15. Then he got up, put both working burners on for coffee and eggs, and started his Thursday like the man he actually was. 32 years old, 4 stitches, bruised ribs, 1 gray suit that needed either replacing or retiring, and a job that started after the holidays. Once he'd taken his daughter somewhere, the snow was still white. The snow in Colorado was white. Lily had pressed her face against the airplane in a Kolskin window for the last 40 minutes of the descent, watching the mountains come up through the clouds. And when they landed and walked out of the terminal into air that was cold in a completely different way from Chicago, cold, cleaner, thinner, with the faint smell of pine that Chicago could not have offered under any meteorological conditions, she turned to her father and said with the solemn satisfaction of a person whose research has been validated, "I told you." "You told me," Nolan agreed. They spent 5 days in a small rental cabin outside a town whose main street was 1 hardware store, 1 diner, 1 bar, and a ski equipment shop that also sold coffee and seemed to be the social center of the community. Did not ski, Nolan had not budgeted for ski lessons and equipment rental, and Lily had not pushed for it, because she had inherited from somewhere the particular pragmatism of a person who understands the difference between what they want and what is currently available. Instead, she built things in the snow. Elaborate things, structures that started as snowmen's and evolved into something more architecturally ambitious over the course of each afternoon, with an internal chambers and connecting tunnels that Nolan suspected she had also researched, though he didn't ask. He sat on the cabin's small porch and drank coffee and watched her work. He read 2 books, actual physical books, paperbacks, the kind he used to read in waiting periods between federal operations when there was nothing to do but stay alert and occupy your mind. He hadn't read books in 3 years. He'd meant to, yet, in the same vague way, you mean to do things that require sustained attention when your days are subdivided into school pickups and overnight assessments and the constant low arithmetic of making the money cover the month. He slept 8 hours 3 nights in a row, which hadn't happened since Claire was alive. On the 4th morning, Lily came to breakfast, with snow still in her hair from the previous day's construction project, and a look on her face that he recognized as the look that preceded a question she'd been working up to. He waited. She ate half her eggs, drank her orange juice, looked at the window, at the mountain visible through it, at the way the morning light came off the snow in a way that had no gray in it at all. "Dad," she said, "yeah, the new job, is it safer?" He thought about how to answer that, honestly, to an 8-year-old who was also, in the relevant ways, considerably older than 8. "The job itself is mostly sitting in meetings and writing reports," he said. "Reviewing security plans, looking at systems. But sometimes it's like the hotel. Sometimes situations become something other than what they started as. That's true of a lot of work." She nodded seriously. "You'll be home for dinner. That's the deal I made." She considered this. "Okay," she said, and went back to her eggs. Because 8 years old, even the particular version of 8 that Lily was had a limit to how long it could sustain abstract concern before the eggs required attention again. Looked out at the white mountain and drank his coffee, and thought, okay. They flew back to Chicago on a Sunday. By Monday, he was at the Halstead Industries building for orientation with the legal and HR teams. The administrative work of becoming officially, documentedly, part of something institutional rather than operating in the peripheral spaces where independent contractors lived. He signed things. He was issued a building access card and an email address and was shown an office on the 32nd floor. 2 floors below Sabrina's, which was a clean, simple space with a window that faced north toward the lake. It had a desk and 2 chairs and nothing on the walls. He left it that way for 2 weeks while he assessed what the division actually needed before he started putting things in rooms that might need to be rearranged. This step turned out to be the correct instinct. The first full security audit of Halstead Industries' existing systems took 11 days and produced a 43-page report that was thorough enough to be uncomfortable reading for several people in the building. 3 existing security vendors were terminated within the month. The external audit of the company's financials, the one Sabrina had ordered immediately following the attack, took 6 weeks and produced findings that confirmed, in precise accounting language, scope of what Victor had been extracting over 14 years. The number was larger than even Nolan's estimate had suggested. Wasn't present for the board meeting, where those findings were presented. He didn't need to be. What he received 3 days later was a memo from Sabrina, not an email, an actual printed memo, which he noted as a deliberate choice, informing him that the audit findings had been submitted in full to the federal investigation, that 3 additional board members had resigned upon review of what the governance failures had allowed to persist, and that the reconstituted board had ratified the Independent Security and Risk Division Charter by unanimous vote. At the bottom of the memo, in handwriting rather than typed, unanimous. I thought you'd want to know that specifically. He did want to know that specifically. The federal case against Victor Langley moved with the particular grinding momentum of federal cases slowly publicly. Period updates that appeared in the news and that Nolan followed with the detached attention of someone who has provided his statement and is now a witness rather than a participant. Victor's attorneys entered a not guilty plea, which was expected. Carver Group investigation expanded to include individuals in 3 additional states and 2 foreign entities, which was larger than Reyes had initially indicated, but which Reyes, in a follow-up call to Nolan in January, said had been suspected from the beginning. Infrastructure acquisition schemes at this scale. Don't stay domestic, Reyes said. The Chicago contract was the crown jewel, but it wasn't the whole collection. How long does the case take? Nolan asked. Federal conspiracy with this many defendants and this much financial documentation? 2 years minimum before trial. Could be 4. And Langley specifically. He's going to try to deal, Reyes said. He has information about the Carver Group's full network that we want. Whether he has enough to trade for a meaningful reduction depends on how good his lawyers are at convincing him he doesn't have better options. A pause. He's 61. He understands arithmetic. Nolan understood arithmetic too. Victor Langley would spend a significant portion of whatever remained of his life in federal proceedings, and, after that, in a federal institution. The infrastructure he'd tried to sell access to would not be sold. The company he'd tried to inherit through a dead woman's chair was being rebuilt from the inside by that woman, who was very much alive and proving to be significantly harder to remove from the landscape than he'd calculated. Felt like sufficient consequence. In February, the external audit cleared Sabrina and Halstead Industries of any knowing participation in Victor's Shell Corporation scheme. The finding was not surprising. The financial architecture had been specifically designed to be invisible to internal review, which was why it had survived 14 years, but the public confirmation mattered for the company's standing and for the contract negotiations that Sabrina had suspended and was now carefully reinitiating. Was involved in the security assessment of the revised contract terms. Yes, he intervened. The infrastructure access provisions were restructured to include oversight mechanisms that hadn't existed in the original version audit triggers, third-party monitoring requirements, access logging systems that created accountability at every level. It was detailed, unglamorous work, the kind that happened in rooms with too many lawyers and not enough windows. Nolan found that he was good at it, in the way that people are good at things they've been thinking about for years without a venue can skate. The charter principle came up twice in those meetings. Once, when a city attorney tried to table a security recommendation because it came from a division that was new and unproven, and Nolan quoted the charter language directly and asked the city attorney whether he had evidentiary objections to the recommendation's substance rather than its source. The city attorney did not have evidentiary objections. The recommendation stood. The second time was when a board member suggested, in a tone that was technically neutral, but carried the specific freight of institutional skepticism, that the division's independence was an unusual structure that created accountability gaps. Sabrina responded before Nolan could. The accountability gap, she said, is what happens when warnings don't get evaluated on their merits. We had that structure. We know what it costs. She looked at the board member with the direct, unhurried attention that Nolan had come to recognize as her particular mode of telling someone they were wrong without raising her voice. The division stays as chartered. It stayed as chartered. On the first Sunday in March, Lily was at Donna's for the afternoon, and Nolan was at the apartment doing the ordinary inventory of a weekend, the laundry, the grocery list, the third burner that had finally given up and needed replacing. He was looking up appliance repair services when a text arrived from a number he had saved but which didn't text him often. There's a diner near your neighborhood, corner of Clark and Roscoe. I've walked past it twice in the last week. Do you know it? He looked at the text for a moment. He did know it. He and Lily had breakfast there most Sunday mornings when he didn't have work. It was the kind of place that had been on that corner for 30 years and would be there for 30 more, the laminate countertops and the coffee that was hot and reliable and not interesting. The staff who recognized regulars without making it a production. The booths along the window where you could watch the neighborhood go about its Sunday and feel, if you were inclined to feel such things, that you were part of something that had been going on longer than your particular problems. So, he typed back, I know it. A pause. Would it be strange if I suggested coffee there sometime? He thought about this for a moment. He thought about the Harrington Grand, the lobby bench, and the apology that was a real one, and the memo with the handwritten note at the bottom, the way she'd said the principal out loud in a board meeting when she didn't have to. He thought about Lily at Donna's this afternoon, coloring something, probably, or researching the next trip she intended to propose. He thought about Claire, briefly and specifically not as an obstacle or a comparison or a weight, as a person who had known him completely and who had said, last month when they both understood the shape of things, don't be lonely on purpose. It doesn't suit you and it's not good for Lily. He typed back, next Sunday. 10 o'clock, they make decent eggs. The reply came in under a minute. I'll find out. He put his phone down and went back to the appliance repair search because the burner still needed replacing, and that was the actual immediate problem, and Sunday was a week away. The following Sunday was the kind of Chicago March morning that couldn't decide what it wanted, cloud cover moving fast, occasional thin sun. Yes, he'd intervened in that transitional range where you needed a coat, but the coat felt like an argument you weren't sure you were winning. Arrived at the diner at 9:58, in a jacket that was not the gray suit jacket, and a shirt that was not wrinkled, which represented a level of preparation that he acknowledged internally and did not mention to anyone. Sabrina was already there. She was in the window booth, both hands around a coffee cup, looking out at Clark Street with the expression of someone doing exactly what she said, seeing what the neighborhood looked like on a Sunday morning. She was dressed in a way that had no corporate signaling in it whatsoever, which on her looked like a decision rather than an absence. Dark coat, simple, no jewelry that Nolan could see from the doorway. Security detail, no assistant, no folder. She saw him come in, and something in her expression shifted into the specific arrangement of a person who is not going to pretend they weren't waiting, but is also not going to make it larger than it was. He slid into the booth across from her. "You were here early," he said. "I'm always early," she said. "It's a problem. I'm usually 7 minutes early." "You beat me. I was 12 minutes early." She said it with the flat candor of someone who has stopped being embarrassed about accurate information. "I walked around the block once, so I wouldn't be 15. The server came a woman named Ruth, whose name Nolan knew, because she had worked this Sunday shift for the 4 years he'd been coming here, and had never once asked him how he was doing in the way that required a real answer, which he appreciated. Ruth looked at Sabrina with the brief evaluative attention of someone assessing a new face in a regulars booth, apparently decided she was acceptable, and poured coffee without being asked. "Eggs?" Ruth asked, generally. "Please," Nolan said. Sabrina looked at the menu for about 4 seconds. "Whatever toast." Ruth left. Across the table, Sabrina wrapped her hands back around her coffee cup and looked at him with the directness that he'd identified within the first 10 minutes of knowing her, and that he'd come to understand was not a performance of confidence, but simply how she was. Wired forward-facing, no deflection. The face she put toward things was the face she put toward them. "Strange," she said. "A little," he agreed. "I've had approximately 200 professional meetings with you in the last 3 months. This is different. Different format. Different format," she agreed. "I don't entirely know what I'm doing." He looked at her. This was not a thing he would have expected her to say 3 months ago. The woman who'd looked at his second-hand suit and told him she wasn't certain he was in a position to tell her anything, that woman did not say, "I don't entirely know what I'm doing," across a diner booth. No. Something had shifted in her. Somewhere in the months between the Harrington Grand and this Sunday morning, and he thought it was probably not a single thing, but an accumulation. Victor. The audit. Board meetings. Yes. And the press conference where she'd said the failure was hers, and the charter she'd written by hand in the margin of a legal document. The work of a person who has encountered the limits of their own certainty and decided to be honest about it, rather than reconstruct a new certainty to replace the old one. "You said dinner," he said, in the lobby. "You said dinner, not coffee." Decided to work up to it. A pause. "That's also new for me. Working up to things. How's it going so far?" "The coffee is decent," she said. "Company is acceptable." He almost smiled. High praise. She looked at him for a moment, the real look, not the professional one. The one that appeared in the service corridor of the Harrington Grand when she was lying on her stomach next to an Iceman sculptor, and he was explaining what was going to happen next, and she was deciding whether to trust him. The look she'd had on the 38th floor when she'd said, "I trusted you," and meant it in the way you mean things when you've just demonstrated them. "How's Lily?" she asked. "Good. She's at her grandmother's today." He paused. "She's been asking about the mountains again. Apparently once is not sufficient. She sounds like someone who knows what she wants. She gets that from her mother." The sentence landed between them without awkwardness, which was something. There had been a version of this conversation 3 months ago where Claire would have been a wait in the room not mentioned, carefully avoided, present by her absence. This was not that version. Had gotten to a place with it. Slowly, imperfectly, yes. Over 2 years of getting up every morning and making the cereal and doing the pickup, and deciding every single day to be present, instead of somewhere in the past. And the place he'd gotten to was not peace exactly, but something workable. Something that let him say his late wife's name in a sentence without the sentence collapsing under it. She sounds remarkable, Sabrina said, carefully, meaning it. She is, he said simply. Ruth brought the eggs. They ate without the pressure of agenda, which was new for both of them, because every interaction they'd had since November 14th had had an agenda: the investigation, the charter audit, the contract review, board meetings. There had always been a folder or a recorder or a next item. There was no next item here. There was scrambled eggs and coffee and Clark Street going about its Sunday outside the window, a dog walker negotiating 3 leashes, couple walking too slowly for the temperature because they were talking, and the talking mattered more than the cold. I owe you an honest question, Sabrina said, when the eggs were mostly finished. Go ahead. The night of the reception, when I said what I said about your suit, about whether someone at your level was in a position to tell me anything. She looked at her coffee cup, then back at him. How much of what you did afterward was spite? He blinked. She waited, with the patience of someone who has asked an uncomfortable question and is not going to help you around it. He thought about it honestly, the way she'd asked it, not the diplomatic answer, not the version that made him look like a man operating purely from duty. Some, he said. She nodded, like that was the answer she'd expected and had needed to hear in those exact words. I would have protected you regardless, he said, because that was the job and because people were going to get hurt, and because that's not a calculation I make based on whether the person being threatened has been courteous to me. He paused. But there was a part of me, when I came off that wall and crossed that room, that wanted to be right. Just to protect you. To be right in front of the people who'd laughed. That's human, she said. It's not entirely comfortable to admit. She agreed. But it's honest. And honest is what I'm trying to operate on these days. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. Spent 30 years being very good at reading situations and very bad at reading people. I could tell you the financial health of a company from a quarterly report in 20 minutes. Couldn't tell you whether the man who ran it for 14 years was stealing from it. She said it without self-pity, just as a fact about herself that she'd arrived at and was working with. I substituted judgment about appearances for judgment about character. It's faster, and it's usually wrong, and I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway because it's what I'd been taught to do. A pause. Everyone. The business school. The board. My father, to some extent, he was a brilliant man, and he had a lot of confidence in his ability to read a room, and some what I took from him was good, and some of it was the particular blindness of someone who was almost always the smartest person present, and started assuming the judgment came with the intelligence, automatically. She exhaled. Vic worked for my father for a decade before he worked for me. That trust was inherited. I never examined it because it was already there. Now I examine everything. She looked at him directly, including myself, particularly myself. The Sunday crowd was filling the diner, around them regulars. A family with 2 young children in the next booth. Someone with a newspaper actually made of paper, which Nolan noted as a rarity. The noise level rose to the comfortable ambient hum of a full room, which gave their conversation a privacy it wouldn't have had in silence. What do you want? Nolan asked. From he gestured between them, briefly, at the booth and the coffee and the knot folder. She looked at him for a moment. I want to know you, she said. Your professional history, not the security assessment, not the person who kept me alive on the 42nd floor. The actual person. A pause. I want to know about Lily and about Claire and about what you read and what you think about when you're not working, and whether you're funny. You've given me occasional evidence but not a full picture. Whether I'm funny. You have a dry delivery that I think is deliberate. I haven't decided yet. It's partly deliberate, he said. Partly just how I sound. That's a very unfunny answer about being funny. And some intervened, I know. And something happened that hadn't quite happened. In the 4 months they'd known each other, not in the corridors of the Harrington Grand or the 38th floor security room or the 34th floor conference room, with the city spread out behind them. Something that wasn't the professional acknowledgement she'd described as something in the corner of her mouth, and wasn't the relief of crisis resolved, and wasn't the careful civility of two people building a working relationship on the wreckage of a catastrophic night. She smiled, a real one, the kind that takes up more of a face than people intend when they're not managing their expression. And it changed what she looked like, completely took 10 years off her, and put something human in the place where the composure usually was, though. He found that he was smiling too, which was not something he'd planned. They stayed in the booth for another hour. He told her about Lily's architectural constructions in Colorado, about the research that had preceded them, about the morning Lily had informed him with complete seriousness that she thought she might want to be a structural engineer or possibly a professional dog walker, and was keeping both options open. He told her about Claire, not the illness, and the ending. The way she'd been precise and funny and occasionally infuriating in the specific way of someone who is almost always right and knows it. The way she'd given him the tie clip and the line about behaving himself. The way she'd said things to him in the last months that he was still working through, slowly, on his own schedule. Sabrina listened to all of it, without redirecting toward herself, without filling pauses with her own stories before he'd finished, which was a quality Nolan found rarer than it should have been. She told him things, too, about growing up with a father who was more present in the company than at the dinner table, and about learning to love him anyway, about the specific loneliness of inheriting something massive from someone before she was ready and deciding to be ready anyway, about the two friends she'd had before she became CEO who she was now working on not losing, about the fact that she ran 3 miles every morning at 5:30, not because she enjoyed it, but because she needed 30 minutes of something where the outcome was purely her own effort and nothing else. That's an honest reason, Nolan said. I told you. I'm working on honest. Ruth refilled their coffee without being asked, which was her way of indicating that the booth was theirs as long as they needed it, a grace note that Nolan had benefited from enough times to recognize. Outside, the March morning had made a decision toward sun, the cloud cover pulling back, the light off the sidewalk, changing from gray to something with warmth in it. The dog walker coming back around the block, with her 3 charges now more willing participants than they'd been an hour before. Dinner, Sabrina said. Eventually. She said it the way she said things, when she'd decided them not as a question, not as a proposal, but as a statement of intent that she was putting into the world and waiting to see received. Next week, he said, next week. Somewhere that isn't a hotel banquet hall. Relatively low bar, he said. I'm setting realistic standards. He looked at her across the booth, at the woman who'd been 30 years old and in possession of a $600 million contract and a company her father had built, who had looked at a worn suit and made a fast judgment and been almost entirely wrong about it, and who had survived everything that followed that judgment and come out on the other side different in ways that mattered. Not fixed, nobody got fixed. That wasn't how it worked. But different, paying a different kind of attention than she had been before. Okay, he said. Okay, she agreed. He left the tip on the table, cash, the same amount he always left Ruth, which was more than the percentage, because that was what you did for someone who gave you a booth on Sunday mornings without making it a transaction. Sabrina saw him do it and said nothing, which was also the correct response. Walked out of the diner together onto Clark Street. The sun was fully out now, the cold wearing it like something reluctant. The March light doing what March light does in Chicago, when it finally commits cutting sharp and clean and making everything look temporarily redeemed. Kind of morning that doesn't make promises, but makes you forget briefly that it can't. Sabrina turned up her collar and looked at him. Same time next Sunday, she said. Before dinner. Lily might want to join. He looked at her. Be okay with that? I'd like to meet her, she said simply. That's how this goes. I'd like to know her. Not as a footnote. A pause. Kids know when they're a footnote. He thought about Lily, about the look she'd given him from the steps of Donna's building the day after the Harrington Grand, about she'd be proud too. After the mad part, the eggs this morning, and okay, a girl who researched snowpack before a trip and kept her professional options open between engineering and dog walking, and asked questions and deserved real answers. She'd probably interrogate you, he said. I've testified before a federal investigation, Sabrina said. I can handle an 8-year-old. He wasn't entirely certain that was true, but he thought he'd let her find out for herself. They went separate directions. On Clark Street, her so south, him north, the ordinary geometry of two people, leaving the same place toward different parts of their day. He walked 3 blocks before he stopped and looked up at the sky, which was doing its temporary redemption thing, the kind you didn't put too much faith in, but that you also didn't dismiss just because it wasn't permanent. 3 months ago, a man in a second-hand suit had walked into a glass reception hall and seen things that other people weren't looking for, and the woman running that hall had decided in 10 seconds that he wasn't worth listening to. Everything that followed the ice sculpture, the service corridors, the ventilation shaft, the 42nd floor, the gun and the plaster, and the 4 stitches, and the charter in the conference room, and the diner, and the booth, and the smile that took up more of her face than she intended, all of it had come from that. Original, ordinary, expensive failure of attention. The failure of a person looking at another person and deciding what they were worth before they'd finished listening. It was not a remarkable failure. It happened in rooms everywhere, every day, at reception desks and hiring meetings and dinner tables and street corners. The fast assessment, the shortcut, the decision made on the surface of a thing instead of its substance. Most of the time, it didn't cost anyone their life. Most of the time, the person dismissed walked away, and no gunfire followed. Cost was still real. It was paid in the quieter currency of voices not heard and warnings not taken, and people made to feel that what they knew and who they were was not sufficient because they just didn't present it in the right packaging. Had carried that cost for 8 years. He had the specific, personal knowledge of what it felt like to be right and dismissed, of what it cost when the dismissal compounded into something irreversible. He'd built the charter on that knowledge, and written it into a legal document, made it a requirement rather than a suggestion. He knew standing on Clark Street in the March sun that the charter was not the whole answer. Charter was the structure. The structure mattered. What actually changed things was not a piece of paper, but a person, a 30-year-old woman, who had survived the consequences of her own fast judgment and decided in the aftermath to be different. Not in the dramatic, announced way of someone performing growth, but in the small, consistent way of someone actually doing it, writing in the margin in her own handwriting, saying the failure was hers in front of reporters, asking a diner server for eggs and meaning it as a real beginning, was harder than the charter, and more important. He started walking north toward home, toward the apartment with the 2 working burners, and the water stain shaped like a dog, and the half-finished drawing on the table, and the pickup at 3:15. Toward the specific life he'd chosen, piece by piece, in the years since he'd walked away from the career that had cost him enough. Phone buzzed. A text from Lily at Donna's. Grandma says you're having coffee with your boss. Is she nice? He typed back, she's getting there. A pause. Is she pretty? Then, is she pretty? He stopped walking. He looked at that text for a moment with the combination of amusement and mild alarm that his daughter regularly produced in him without apparent effort. That's not a professional question, he typed. I'm not at work, she replied immediately. Which was, he acknowledged, a fair point. He pocketed his phone and kept walking past the hardware store and the dry cleaner and the coffee shop that had appeared 3 years ago and that he had never entered on principle, and that was always busy. Past the familiar block, the familiar buildings, the city that had been his for 32 years in one form or another, and that had not, in all that time, ever been particularly interested in whether his suit was new. He got home, put the kettle on, sat at the kitchen table with the remainder of his Sunday arranged in front of him in the ordinary way: the grocery list, the appliance search, a report he needed to review before Monday morning. The window faced west, and the sun was on it, now moving through the afternoon, the kind of light that made even a modest kitchen look, briefly, like somewhere a person could be glad to be. Picked up the silver tie clip from where he'd left it on the counter. He held it for a moment. Then he set it down gently in a different spot, not the counter, but the small shelf above the counter that held the things he actually wanted to keep track of. Place where Lily's school permission slips went, and the spare key to Donna's, and the two things that had mattered enough to him over the years to earn a permanent home inside the controlled disorder of daily life. He left it there and went back to his Sunday. Because the story was over, stories about people rarely are. They continue in the direction the people take them, shaped by choices and whether and what gets said across diner tables on March mornings. Because the part that needed resolving had resolved. Victor was in federal proceedings. The company was being rebuilt properly. Charter was written and ratified, and already being used in rooms where the old rules had previously applied. His daughter was at her grandmother's planning her next research project. Yes, he'd intervened. The woman he'd had coffee with this morning would have dinner with him next week, and the week after that they'd figure out together. And Nolan Beckett, 32 years old, 4 stitches healed to a thin scar above his cheekbone, ribs back to functional, one suit recently replaced with something that actually fit, one job that used what he knew, one daughter who was the whole point of everything, had finished building, quietly and without announcement, the life that was actually his. The one he'd had before, which was gone. Not the one he'd planned, which had not survived contact with what happened. This one, the one that had come from all of it, from the loss and the corridor and the second-hand suit and the red laser dot and 4 stitches and a handwritten note in a margin and a smile that took up more of a face than intended. This exact life on this exact Sunday, with the kettle heating and Lily coming home at 3:15 and the silver tie clip on the shelf where it could be found. That was enough. That was in fact everything.